Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. The smell of blue. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. Chapter 1. My name is Elias Thorne, and for the last 6 years, my world has been measured in 24 by 36-inch sheets of Bristol board and the satisfyingly neat rainbow of acrylics on my supply shelf. I teach art at Oak Creek Middle School. It's a good job in a quiet town. Oak Creek, Illinois, is the kind of place people move to for the schools and the illusion of safety that comes with wide, sycamore-lined streets, where the most exciting event of the year is the annual Founders Day picnic. I came here from Chicago to escape the noise, the hurry, the relentless friction of millions of lives grinding against each other. I craved the mundane. I was, for a time, deeply content with it. The first tremor in my well-ordered reality came on a Tuesday in late September. The air held the first crisp promise of autumn, and the art room was drenched in that specific golden light that makes every color feel warmer, richer. We were doing a unit on color theory, specifically the emotional impact of color. Van Gogh's blues, Rothko's reds. All right, settle down, I said, clapping my hands. Today we're doing landscapes. I don't want you to paint what you see out the window. I want you to paint what you feel. A typical, slightly nebulous art teacher instruction. Usually, it resulted in some interestingly moody skies and a few aggressively purple trees. But today was different. It was Chloe Miller, a bright, usually reserved 7th grader, who started it. She sat frowning at her palette, a brush loaded with cerulean blue hovering over her paper. Mr. Thorne. Yes, Chloe. I can't use this blue. Why not? It's a beautiful color. She wrinkled her nose. It smells too sharp today. It hurts my teeth. I paused, halfway to helping another student. It smells sharp. I walked over to her desk. I leaned in and sniffed the small dollop of paint. It smelled faintly of acrylic binder, the same sterile, plastic-adjacent scent it always had. I think you're just being poetic, Chloe. That's good. Use that. Paint a sky that looks like a sharp smell. She gave me a look of profound confusion, as if I'd just suggested she paint with sound. She put the brush down and picked up a sap green instead. The green is quieter, she murmured, more to herself than to me. I filed it away as a moment of adolescent quirkiness. Kids were creative. They made strange, wonderful connections. It was my job to encourage that. I didn't think about it again until Thursday, when Marcus, a boisterous 8th grader who usually painted everything with the subtlety of a house fire, complained about his cadmium yellow. It tastes sour, Mr. T, he said, wiping his tongue theatrically, though his brush was nowhere near his mouth. Like a lemon that's gone bad. You didn't eat the paint, did you, Marcus? I asked, my voice a well-worn groove of feigned exasperation. No. But I can still taste it. It's making my whole painting taste wrong. Several other students nodded in agreement. A girl in the back, Maya, chimed in, he's right. And the forest green is humming too loud. A low murmur of assent went through the room. Humming. Tasting. Smelling. It felt coordinated, like a new piece of slang I was too old to understand. Is this a TikTok thing? I asked, the question making me feel ancient. A new meme? They just stared at me. There was no glimmer of a shared joke in their eyes, no suppressed smirks. There was only the placid certainty of a shared experience. An experience from which I was excluded. Okay, I said slowly. Let's just focus on the shapes for now. The silence that followed was heavy, filled with the low hum of the fluorescent lights and the scent of, as far as I could tell, only paint and paper. Chapter 2. The following week, the lexicon of sensory confusion had bled beyond my classroom walls. I was in the teacher's lounge, nursing a cup of lukewarm coffee, when Sarah Jenkins, the 8th grade science teacher, sat down opposite me. Sarah was a bastion of empirical data and logical positivism. Her world was made of atoms and reactions, things that could be measured and proven. "Eli, you will not believe the essay I just graded," she said, pushing her glasses up her nose. The assignment was to describe the process of photosynthesis. Simple. Straightforward. And I prompted. And I got a 3-page paper from Kevin Riley on how the loudness of the green in the leaves determines the sweetness of the oxygen produced. He called chlorophyll a resounding chord. A chord, Eli. I felt a cold stone drop in my stomach. I've been hearing things like that in my class, I admitted. Kids talking about colors having smells and tastes. Sarah waved a dismissive hand. It's a fad. They're probably all on some new social media platform where they talk like this. It's like when they were all saying, yeet. It'll pass. I wanted to believe her. I desperately wanted to file this under incomprehensible youth culture and move on. But Kevin Riley's essay felt different from yeet. It was a fundamental misapprehension of reality, presented as fact. Sarah, the scientist, saw it as bad grammar, a failure of education. I, the artist, saw it as a warping of perception, and it unnerved me. The feeling deepened that Saturday. I was in Miller's Grocery, the local supermarket whose fluorescent lights always seem to bleach the color out of everything. I was standing in the produce section, trying to decide between romaine and iceberg, when I overheard 2 women buy the bell peppers. They were probably in their 50s, dressed in a comfortable athleisure wear that served as the Oak Creek weekend uniform. "Oh, don't get the green ones, Carol," one said, holding a pepper up to her ear. "Listen to that hum. They're always so bitter when they're that noisy." Carol nodded sagely. "You're right. The red has a much gentler flavor note this week. Much better for the stir-fry." I froze, my hand hovering over the lettuce. It wasn't just the kids. It was spreading. Or maybe, I thought with a dizzying sense of vertigo, it had always been here, and I was just now noticing. Had people always talked this way? Had I been so lost in my own world that I'd missed a fundamental aspect of human communication? No. That was impossible. I would have remembered. My entire career was based on the shared understanding of color as a purely visual phenomenon. Red was red because it looked red. It didn't have a flavor. Green didn't have a volume. I abandoned my shopping cart in the aisle, the squeak of its wobbly wheel suddenly grating on my nerves. I walked out of the store into the bright, clear afternoon. The sky was a vast, silent, odorless dome of blue. The leaves on the trees were a mute, tasteless green. My reality was still intact. But I felt a new, creeping dread. It was the feeling of standing on a shoreline, watching the tide go out much, much further than it ever should. Chapter 3. I started a journal. Not a paper one, but a locked note on my phone, titled Sensory Anomalies. It felt absurd, like the paranoid scribblings of a conspiracy theorist. September 28, overheard at post office. Man complaining that the blue of the mailbox was too sharp, said it made his eyes water. September 30th, Chloe Miller's new painting is entirely brown and gray. When asked, she said she wanted to make something quiet. October 2nd, radio ad for a local car dealership. Come on down for our red tag sale. We've got the sweetest deals in town. The announcer lingered on the word sweetest, as if it were a literal descriptor of the color red. I tried to rationalize it. Metaphorical language was becoming more literal. Perhaps it was a linguistic shift, a collective drift in semantics. Society did that. Words changed meaning. But this felt different. This wasn't a word changing, it was the entire sensory hierarchy being dismantled and reassembled into a nonsensical collage. My attempts to get a straight answer were met with a strange, placid wall. Why do you say the lettuce is loud? I asked the produce manager at Miller's. A man named Gary whom I'd known for years. He just looked at me, his brow furrowed. What do you mean? It just is. You can hear it. A low C sharp, mostly. Helps you know it's fresh. He said it with the same casual authority he would use to explain the difference between a Honeycrisp and a Gala apple. He looked at me with an expression of faint pity, as if I were colorblind or deaf. I felt a profound sense of dislocation. These were the people I saw every day, the bricks and mortar of my quiet life. Now, they were strangers, speaking a language I couldn't comprehend, perceiving a world I couldn't access. My carefully constructed reality, the one I had fled Chicago to find, was dissolving into a sea of sensory gibberish. I was the crazy one. I was the one who couldn't hear the lettuce. The isolation was a physical weight. At school, I'd watch students in the hallways pointing at posters, not discussing the image, but the texture of the orange or the pitch of the purple. In the evenings, I'd sit in my silent house, the walls a neutral beige that I had chosen specifically for its inoffensiveness. Now, I was grateful for it. It was a blank space in a world that was becoming deafeningly, nauseatingly vibrant in all the wrong ways. I stopped listening to the radio. I avoided crowded places. I felt like the sole sober person at a party where everyone else had taken the same strange, perception-altering drug. They were all happy, all connected in their shared delusion, while I was left on the outside, clinging to a reality that was slipping away like sand through my fingers. Chapter 4. The breaking point, the moment my observer status ended and my participation began, came on a Saturday night a few weeks into October. I was in my studio, the small spare bedroom I'd converted into a workspace. It was my sanctuary, the one place where the rules still made sense. Canvases were lined against one wall, the air thick with the familiar, comforting smells of turpentine and linseed oil. I was working on a personal piece, a large abstract canvas, trying to pour some of my anxiety into it. I needed to feel grounded, and for me, that meant painting. I reached for a tube of ultramarine blue, my favorite color, a deep, resonant blue that felt like staring into the twilight sky. I squeezed a generous amount onto my glass palette. And then I smelled it. It wasn't the paint. It was something else. A sharp, piercing scent, like ozone after a lightning strike mixed with the acrid tang of crushed mint leaves. It was so sudden, so intense, it made my nostrils flare and my eyes water. My heart hammered against my ribs. I dropped the brush. It clattered onto the floor, leaving a blue smear on the wood. I looked around the room, frantic. Had I knocked something over? A bottle of cleaning fluid? An air freshener? I sniffed the air, turning in a slow circle. The smell was gone. I knelt, sniffing the floor, the walls. Nothing. Just dust and old paint. My gaze fell back to the palette. I leaned in cautiously, my nose hovering an inch above the dollop of ultramarine. There it was. Faint, but unmistakable. The sharp, ozonic smell. It was coming from the blue paint. I recoiled as if I'd been burned. It was impossible. It defied every law of physics Sarah Jenkins held dear. Pigment could not generate a scent. It was a passive reflector of light, nothing more. I stumbled back, my hand gripping the edge of my work table. I squeezed my eyes shut, pressing my knuckles into the sockets. Stress, I told myself. You're stressed. You're overtired. Your brain is playing tricks on you. It was a textbook olfactory hallucination, a phantom smell triggered by anxiety. It had to be. I took a deep, shuddering breath and opened my eyes. I looked at the palette again. The blue sat there, inert, silent, and, I forced myself to believe, completely odorless. But I couldn't bring myself to touch it. I spent the rest of the night staring at the canvas, the half-finished painting mocking me with its silent, scentless colors. The quiet contagion had breached my final defense. It wasn't just in their heads anymore. It was in mine. Or worse, it was in the world itself, and I was just finally starting to notice. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. Chapter 5. The official notice arrived in the mail on a Monday, tucked between a credit card offer and a flyer for lawn care. It was printed on thick, cream-colored cardstock, embossed with the Oak Creek town seal. It announced a special session of the town council. The agenda item listed was, Public Forum on the Harmonization of Civic Infrastructure, Section 1, Adjusting Traffic Signal Hues to Align with the Predominant Flavor of Red. I read it 3 times. I sat at my kitchen table, the coffee in my mug growing cold, and felt a wave of nausea. This wasn't a fringe movement anymore. It wasn't a quirky fad. It was policy. It was infrastructure. I had to go. The town hall was packed. The air was thick with the scent of cheap coffee and a cloying, communal certainty. I saw my neighbors, my colleagues, the parents of my students. I saw Gary from the grocery store and Carol, the woman who'd been discussing the peppers. They were all here, their faces earnest and civic-minded. Mayor Thompson, a portly man with a perpetually reassuring smile, stood at the podium. Friends, neighbors, he began, for too long, our town's reds have been, discordant. That sharp, slightly bitter tang you get from the stop signs on Maple, the aggressive sourness of the traffic lights downtown, it's not conducive to a peaceful, flowing community. Heads nodded all around me. People murmured in agreement. A woman in front of me whispered to her husband, "He's so right. The Elm Street light always gives me heartburn." I felt like I was in a fever dream. A civil engineer was called to the podium. He unrolled a large diagram showing a color wheel cross-referenced with what looked like a flavor chart. After extensive community polling, the engineer said, pointing a laser at the diagram, "We've identified the target flavor profile. We're moving away from the cranberry jalapeno note of our current red and shifting toward a cherry vanilla hue. It's a warmer, sweeter red. Our simulations show it could reduce commuter stress by up to 12%. My hand shot up. I didn't even think about it. Mayor Thompson squinted at me. "Yes. Mr. Thorne, isn't it? The art teacher." "Yes, Mayor," I said, my voice shaking slightly. I stood up. The room went quiet. 100 pairs of eyes turned to me. "With all due respect, what are you talking about? Red doesn't have a flavor. It's a wavelength of light. This is meaningless." A ripple of confused, pitying laughter went through the room. The mayor's smile became strained. "Now, Mr. Thorne, we appreciate artistic temperament, but this is a matter of public works. The flavor of red is a commonly understood phenomenon. Are you feeling all right?" "It's not a phenomenon," I insisted, my voice rising. "It's metaphor. It's not real." The woman in front of me turned around. It was Chloe Miller's mother. Her expression was one of deep, genuine concern. "Elias," she said softly, as if speaking to a frightened child. "It's okay. Just try to listen. You'll taste it eventually." I sat down, my face burning. I was the town eccentric. The village idiot. The man who couldn't taste the color red. They weren't angry with me. They pitied me. And that was so much worse. I left before the vote, stumbling out into a night where the stop sign at the corner seemed to glare at me with a particularly bitter, offensive tang. Chapter 6. The next day at school, the air was thick with my humiliation. My outburst at the town hall was already the subject of gentle, worried gossip. Sarah found me in the art room during my prep period. "Eli, I heard about last night," she said, her voice soft. She wasn't mocking me. She was worried. "So you think I'm crazy too?" I asked, not bothering to hide the bitterness in my voice. No, of course not, she said, a little too quickly. I just think, maybe you're under a lot of stress. You know, synesthesia is a real neurological condition. Maybe you have a different form of it, and it's making it hard for you to connect with the way most people perceive things. Most people. I spun around, gesturing wildly at the paint shelf. Sarah, a week ago, you were most people. You were the one who thought Kevin Riley's essay was nonsense. What changed? She blinked, genuinely confused. What are you talking about? I never said it was nonsense. I said his grammar was atrocious. But his central point was valid, if poorly expressed. The vibrancy of a color has always correlated with its other sensory outputs. That's basic physics, isn't it? The gaslighting was perfect because it was utterly unconscious. Her memory had been rewritten. The past had been altered to fit the new, insane present. There was no before for her. There was only the self-evident, humming, flavorful now. Are you feeling okay, Eli? She asked, her brow crinkled with the same look of pity I'd seen on every other face. You seem disconnected. I'm fine, I lied, turning my back to her. Just tired. When she left, I sank into my chair, the weight of my isolation pressing down on me, suffocating me. It wasn't just that I was alone in my perception. It was that my past, my shared history with these people, was being erased, overwritten by a collective delusion that now identified itself as fact. I was becoming a ghost in my own life. Chapter 7. My desperation drove me to the one place in town that was supposed to be a repository of the unchanging past, the Oak Creek Public Library. The building itself was a relic, a Carnegie library built of imposing stone and smelling of old paper and bookbinder's glue. Here, I hoped to find answers, a historical precedent for mass hysteria, something, anything, to prove I wasn't losing my mind. The library was quiet, a sanctuary from the increasingly noisy sensory landscape outside. I spent hours combing through psychology textbooks and historical archives, searching for terms like collective delusion, mass psychogenic illness, folie à deux. I found accounts of dancing plagues and fainting spells, but nothing like this. Nothing so quiet, so pervasive, so grammatical. The subplot, the little mystery I clung to, was the town's founder, Jedediah Oak. His stern, bearded face stared out from portraits and the cover of the official town history. He was a 19th-century industrialist who had built the first mill. But tucked away in a dusty old volume of local biographies, I found a curious passage. It described him as a man of peculiar sensibilities, a poet in private who wrote of the silent music of the stones and the bitter taste of the evening sky. It was a flicker of connection, a historical echo of the madness outside. Was this a clue? Or was I just pattern-seeking, my paranoid mind trying to weave a narrative out of thin air? The town librarian, Mr. Abernathy, was a man who seemed as old as the books he curated. He was thin and dry, with hands like crumpled parchment. He had been, up to this point, an island of normalcy. I brought the book to his desk. Mr. Abernathy, I began, I was reading about Jedediah Oak. He looked up over his spectacles, his eyes clear and sharp. A fascinating man. The soul of a painter trapped in the body of a capitalist. My heart leaped. So you've read his poetry? Oh, yes, he said, a faint smile on his lips. Most of it is dreadful, to be honest. But his descriptions of color, they were ahead of their time. He seemed like an ally, a fellow scholar of the old world. I felt a surge of hope. I was about to confide in him, to unload the burden of the past few weeks, when he paused. His gaze drifted to a bright blue book on a nearby cart. He frowned. "Forgive me, young man," he said, his voice suddenly distant. "That book, the smell is quite distracting. A very shrill F-sharp. They really should be more careful when they choose the cover stock." He turned away from me, retrieved the book, and carried it to a back room as if it were a source of foul odor. I stood at his empty desk, the open biography of Jedediah Oak in my hands. The hope drained out of me, replaced by a cold, hollow certainty. He was gone, too. The contagion had seeped into the very bedrock of the past. There were no allies. There was no sanctuary. I was utterly alone. Chapter 8. The world began to fight back. Or rather, the new world began to assert its physical dominance over me. My internal, abstract horror became a constant, physical assault. Walking through the town park, a place I once went for peace, became an ordeal. The lush, vibrant green of the manicured lawn was no longer silent. It emitted a low, pervasive hum, a physical vibration that traveled through the soles of my shoes and resonated in my jaw. It was a grinding, bass note drone that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. The children playing on the grass seemed to enjoy it, laughing as they rolled in the music, while I had to walk on the concrete path to keep from getting nauseous. Food became a minefield. At the grocery store, the bright yellow of the bananas now left a distinct sour taste on my tongue, like battery acid. I had to close my eyes to pick one out, relying on touch alone. The brilliant red of a tomato was so visually sweet that it was cloying, making the actual, subtle taste of the fruit impossible to enjoy. I found myself subsisting on pale, quiet foods, chicken breast, potatoes, white bread, rice. My diet was becoming as beige as my house, a desperate attempt to find sensory neutrality. The worst was the sky. On clear, sunny days, the sheer, overwhelming blueness of it all carried that same sharp, ozonic scent I'd first encountered on my palate. It was a constant, high-pitched smell that scraped at the inside of my sinuses. I started wearing sunglasses and a baseball cap pulled down low, not just to block the light, but to try and block the scent, a futile gesture that only made me look more like a paranoid hermit. My own senses were betraying me, translating the new rules of their world into a physical reality that only I seemed to find painful. I was no longer just an observer of their madness, I was its victim. I wasn't just seeing their world, I was being forced to feel it, taste it, hear it. And it was excruciating. I was a man with normal hearing trapped in a room where everyone else was deaf, and they had decided to turn the music up to a volume that was tearing me apart. Chapter 9. A week after my disastrous visit, I returned to the library. It was a fool's errand, but I was desperate. I had to know if any part of Mr. Abernathy, the man who knew about Jedediah Oak's poetry, remained. I found him in the archives, meticulously cataloging old town records. The air in the small room was thick with the smell of decay, but it was a quiet, natural smell I welcomed. "Mr. Abernathy?" I said softly. He looked up, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of the man I'd spoken to before. A flicker of fear. "Mr. Thorne," he whispered, his voice trembling. He gestured for me to come closer. "It's getting louder, isn't it?" Relief washed over me so intensely I felt dizzy. "Yes. You feel it too." "The colors," he breathed, his eyes wide. "They're shouting. The old books, the brown ones, they're still quiet. But the new ones, the ones with the glossy covers," he trailed off, shuddering. He grabbed a brittle, leather-bound ledger from the table. "Look. I've been checking. The records are changing." He opened the book, his gnarled finger tracing a line of elegant, sepia-toned script. "This is an entry from the town's founding charter, 1888. I have it memorized. It used to say, 'And we dedicate this town to the principles of industry and prosperity.'" My eyes scanned the line he was pointing to. That's not what it said. It read, "And we dedicate this town to the principles of tonal industry and chromatic prosperity." "It's rewriting itself," I whispered, horrified. "The past is literally changing." "It's a consensus," Abernathy rasped, clutching my arm. His grip was surprisingly strong. "A living consensus. But I remember the old words. I remember the silence. As long as one of us remembers. His voice hitched. His eyes unfocused. He was looking over my shoulder at a modern, brightly colored poster on the wall advertising a children's reading hour. It was a cheerful rainbow of primary colors. "Oh, dear," he murmured, his grip on my arm slackening. He blinked slowly, a placid calm smoothing the fear from his face. "Forgive me. The orange on that poster has such a lovely, velvety texture. I was getting carried away." He pulled his hand back. He looked at the ledger in front of him as if seeing it for the first time. "Chromatic prosperity," he read aloud, nodding in satisfaction. "Yes. That's how it's always been." He turned back to his work, humming a tuneless, quiet melody. The last island of the old world had just sunk beneath the waves, and I was left treading water in an ocean of madness, completely and utterly alone. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 3, The Nature of the Threat and Escalation. Chapter 10. My theory solidified in the wake of Mr. Abernathy's dissolution. It wasn't a toxin in the water or a strange radiation from the sky. It wasn't a virus of the mind. It was worse. It was a shift in the fundamental operating system of reality. I sat in my beige house, the quietest place I knew, and pieced it together. Jedediah Oak and his peculiar sensibilities were the seed. A latent idea, planted at the town's founding, that perception could define reality. For over a century, it had lain dormant. But now, in the hyper-connected, meme-driven, trend-obsessed modern world, it had found fertile ground. It started with the kids, the most impressionable, the most networked. A quirky phrase, a synesthetic description, shared and repeated. A TikTok trend that refused to die. At first, it was just language. But language shapes thought. And in Oak Creek, thought was beginning to shape physics. The process was terrifyingly democratic. When a critical mass of people believed, truly, deeply, unconsciously believed, that the color green hummed, it began to hum. When the consensus decided that red had a flavor, the photons themselves were imbued with a gustatory property. It was a consensus reality, and I was in the minority. My stubborn, outdated perception of a world governed by fixed, impersonal laws was being voted out of existence. I wasn't going crazy. The world was. Or rather, it was becoming sane in a new way, and I was the one who was out of sync. I was the last bastion of an old, forgotten physics, a man whose senses were still stubbornly reporting on a reality that no longer existed for anyone else. My pain, the ache in my teeth from the grass, the sour taste from the school bus, was the friction between the old world and the new. It was the sound of my own reality being torn apart. Chapter 11. The escalation was insidious. It came not with a bang, but with a paintbrush. The town began to repaint itself. It started with the new, sweeter, traffic lights, their cherry vanilla glow causing me to gag every time I drove through an intersection. Then came the fire hydrants, painted a shade of yellow so sour that dogs would whine and shy away from them. A civic harmony committee was formed. They went door to door with swatches and tuning forks. My neighbor, Mrs. Gable, had her charming blue Victorian repainted a muddy, ochre brown because its original color had a pitch that was clashing with the sound of the marigolds in her garden. She was thrilled with the result. "It's so much more melodious now, don't you think?" she'd called over the fence, while I stood there, smelling the phantom sharpness of her home's former color like a ghost limb. The consequences were becoming tangible. The weak, sour yellow of the sun on some days, days when the collective mood was apparently bleak, seemed to provide less warmth. The crops on the farms surrounding Oak Creek were struggling. Farmers would stand in their fields, scratching their heads, talking about how the timbre of the soil was off this year. The loud green in the town park wasn't just a sound anymore. The constant, low-frequency vibration was causing hairline cracks to appear in the sidewalks that bordered it. The statue of Jedediah Oak in the town square seemed to be leaning ever so slightly, as if recoiling from the dissonant chord of the newly paved asphalt around its base. Reality was becoming unstable, frayed at the edges by the whims of collective perception. The world I knew wasn't just being painted over, it was being fundamentally undermined, its structural integrity compromised by this new, aesthetic physics. Chapter 12. The knock on my door came on a Wednesday evening. It was the Civic Harmony Committee. I recognized Carol, the pepper woman from the grocery store, and two other residents I vaguely knew. They held up a fan of paint swatches. "Mr. Thorne," Carol began, her smile relentlessly pleasant. "We've had some sensory feedback from your neighbors. Your home's beige siding, I'm afraid it has a very discordant texture." "A texture?" I asked, my hand tightening on the doorknob. "Visually, yes," another man chimed in. "It's very abrasive. Like sandpaper on the eyes. It's lowering the overall tonal quality of the street." Carol held up a swatch of pale, dusty purple. "We've taken the liberty of identifying a more suitable hue. This lilac has a much softer sound. A gentle hum, very peaceful. The town will even subsidize the cost of the paint." I stared at them, standing on my porch, earnestly trying to cure my house of its offensive silence. They were missionaries of the new faith, and I was the lone heretic in my bland, quiet temple. "No," I said. The word felt solid, a piece of the old world. "Thank you, but no. I like my house the way it is." Their smiles faltered. They exchanged confused glances. This was not a response they had anticipated. Refusing harmony was like refusing to breathe. "But Mr. Thorne," Carol said, her voice laced with pity. "It's for the good of the whole street. Your house is quiet. It's a sensory void. It's unsettling." "It's my house," I repeated, my voice hard. "It will remain beige." I closed the door on their bewildered faces. I knew it wasn't the end. I had become a problem to be solved. The man in the dissonant house. The silent note in the middle of their symphony. From my window, I watched them walk away, occasionally glancing back at my house as if it were a blight, a wound in the landscape. My beige walls were no longer a sanctuary, they were a fortress. And I was under siege. Chapter 13. The new reality was not just unsettling, it was becoming actively hostile. My refusal to adapt was making me a target for its chaotic physics. I was driving home from a late-night grocery run, the only time I could stand to be in the store, when it was mostly empty and the colors felt muted under the tired lighting. I approached the intersection of Main and Elm. The traffic light switched from its humming green to its sour yellow, and then to the new, town-approved, cherry vanilla, red. The sensory impact was overwhelming. It wasn't just a color. It was a thick, syrupy wave of sweetness that flooded my car. It was a smell like burnt sugar and a taste so cloyingly powerful that my throat closed up. I gagged, my eyes watering, my stomach churning. My vision blurred. My foot slipped on the brake. The car swerved, hopping the curb and coming to a stop with a jolt on the grass verge, inches from a telephone pole. I sat there, shaking, the phantom sweetness still coating my tongue. The light changed to green, and the air cleared, replaced by the familiar, grinding hum. I had almost crashed my car because a traffic light was too sweet. That was the moment I understood I couldn't fight this. There was no argument to be won, no logic to appeal to. Arguing with the flavor of red was like arguing with gravity. For everyone else in Oak Creek, it was a simple, immutable fact of life. For me, it was a weapon. My life was no longer my own. It was a constant, exhausting process of navigation through a sensory minefield. I couldn't trust my eyes, my nose, my tongue. I began to feel a strange, dislocated sympathy for the people I had once pitied. They weren't mad. They were adapted. They were living in harmony with the new laws of their universe. I was the one living a life of painful, dangerous friction. The choice was becoming stark, adapt, or be broken. Underscore 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 underscore. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. Chapter 14. The town decided to celebrate its new, harmonious reality with an event called the Concert of Hues. It was to be held at dusk in the town park. Flyers, printed in a shade of orange that allegedly had the texture of soft felt, promised a symphonic experience of light and sound. It was the apotheosis of their new world, a grand debut of the fully realized sensory landscape. I had to go. Not to protest, not to fight. I was long past that. I went as a witness, a final chronicler of the world I was losing. I needed to see what I was being crushed by. The park was filled with people. They sat on blankets on the humming grass, their faces turned towards the town square. The entire community was there, my students, my colleagues, my neighbors. Sarah Jenkins sat with her family, her head tilted as if listening to a distant melody. Chloe Miller and her friends lay on their backs, staring up at the sky, their faces rapturous. There were no instruments, no speakers. The orchestra was the town itself. As the sun began to set, a hush fell over the crowd. The performance began. The streetlights flickered on, not with a steady yellow glow, but in a slow, pulsing rhythm of soft lavender that hummed a low, soothing chord. The newly painted storefronts across the square seemed to glow from within, their colors shifting and blending, creating complex visual harmonies. The cherry vanilla red of the stop signs provided a sweet, rhythmic bass note, while the sour yellows of the road markings offered a sharp, percussive counterpoint. To them, it was beautiful. I saw it on their faces, a deep, transcendent peace. To me, it was a cacophony. A sensory nightmare. The lavender hum made my skull vibrate, the sweet red nauseated me, and the sharp, ozonic blue of the twilight sky was a piercing shriek. Pain radiated behind my eyes. I felt my sanity fraying, stretched to its breaking point by this relentless, synesthetic assault. I was a foreign body being rejected by the system. Chapter 15. I staggered away from the crowd, seeking a moment of respite, my hands pressed against my ears. My gaze fell upon the statue of Jedediah Oak, standing dark and silent in the center of the square, a relic of the old world. But in the strange, pulsing light of the concert of hues, it wasn't silent. A faint light seemed to be emanating from its base. I stumbled closer, shielding my eyes from the discordant symphony of the town. There, at the bottom of the granite pedestal, was an inscription I had never noticed before. It wasn't chiseled deep like the founder's name, but seemed almost etched onto the surface, glowing with a soft, internal luminescence. It wasn't words. It was a sequence. A bar of music composed not of notes, but of colors. A swatch of deep indigo, followed by a sliver of ochre, a sharp point of crimson, a wash of pale gray. It was a code. A primer. A seed. And in that moment, I understood. Jedediah Oak, the man with peculiar sensibilities, hadn't just founded a town. He had composed it. He had planted a mimetic virus, a reality-altering suggestion, right into its foundation. He didn't write a charter of laws, he wrote a musical score and waited for the orchestra to learn how to play it. The contagion wasn't an accident of the modern world, it was a design, a latent command that had waited over a century for the right conditions, the right collective consciousness, to execute. We were not the creators of this new reality. We were just the instruments, finally playing his silent, colorful song. Chapter 16. The revelation offered no comfort. The sensory onslaught intensified, the world dissolving into a screaming, painful chaos of crossed wires. The hum of the grass, the smell of the sky, the taste of the traffic lights, it all converged on me, a tidal wave of pure, meaningless data. I fell to my knees at the foot of Jedediah's statue, my mind fracturing under the strain. This was it. The end. I would either be shattered into insanity or suffer a complete sensory overload, a fatal aneurysm brought on by a color. And then, a choice bloomed in the wreckage of my mind. A desperate, final option. I could continue to fight, to pit my dying reality against this new, vibrant one, and be annihilated. Or I could, let go. I squeezed my eyes shut. I took a ragged breath. The sharp, acrid smell of the blue twilight filled my lungs. For weeks, I had recoiled from it. I had fought it. Now, with nothing left to lose, I did the opposite. I focused on it. I let the sharp scent pierce through my panic. I didn't try to rationalize it or deny it. I simply accepted it. I acknowledged the smell of blue. A profound shift occurred. The pain did not vanish, but its context changed. The sensory inputs were still there, the hum, the taste, the smell, but they were no longer an attack. They were just information. The volume of the world had been turned down from a painful shriek to a manageable level. The raw, chaotic data was resolving into a language I could suddenly, terrifyingly, begin to understand. I opened my eyes. The world was breathtaking. The pulsing lilac of the streetlights was a lullaby. The deep, sweet red was a comforting warmth. I looked across the park and saw Chloe Miller smiling. For the first time, I understood her expression. Her smile didn't just look happy, it had the gentle, pleasant texture of brushed canvas. I had not won. I had not escaped. I had surrendered. I had allowed the quiet contagion to rewrite my own source code. I had translated myself into the new language. I stood up, my movements feeling fluid for the first time in months. A gentle breeze rustled the leaves of a nearby oak tree, and a shower of green notes, crisp and melodic, fell around me. I reached out and caught a single leaf. I held it in my palm, not just seeing its color, but feeling its shape, hearing its soft, low chord. It was beautiful. I was home. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My world was built on the 27th floor of the Meridian Tower, a sterile glass needle pricked into the Toronto skyline. It was a world of predictable sounds, the distant sigh of the Gardiner Expressway, the electronic chime of the elevator announcing its arrival, the low hum of my laptop's fan as I waded through the dense, turgid prose of academic dissertations. I was a Lara Vance, freelance editor, a professional polisher of other people's thoughts. My life was a curated quiet, a fortress of solitude amidst the urban clamor. The first crack in that fortress was almost too small to notice. It came from Mrs. Gable, 2702, a woman whose life seemed to run on a schedule as rigid as a metronome. 8:15 a.m., the rattle of her mail slot. 3 p.m., the squeak of her tea kettle. 7:45 p.m., the muffled dialogue of a televised quiz show. One Tuesday, through the peephole's distorted fisheye lens, I watched her return from her grocery run. She placed her reusable bags on the floor, fumbled for her keys, unlocked the door, and then, she paused. She raised her right hand, knuckles bent, and knocked twice on her own door. Rap rap. The sound was crisp, deliberate. Not a fumbling gesture, but a ritual. She then pushed the door open and disappeared inside. I blinked, the peephole's darkness flooding back into my vision. Weird. An old woman's eccentricity, I decided. Maybe she was checking if she'd accidentally left a guest inside. Or perhaps it was a new memory trick, a way to signal to her brain that she was now home. I was good at finding logical explanations, it was part of my job. I dismissed it and returned to a particularly brutal chapter on post-war urban planning policies. But once you hear a sound, you start listening for it. A few days later, a courier buzzed for 2708. I heard the door open, the exchange of pleasantries, the click of a stylus on a tablet. Then, as the resident was closing his door, I heard it again. Rap rap. 2 quick, final taps on the wood before the lock clicked shut. My brow furrowed. Coincidence. That's all. I went down to the lobby to collect a package. The concierge, a young man named Ben whose smile was a permanent fixture, handed it to me. As he turned back to his monitor, his fingers tapped the edge of the screen twice. Rap rap. I froze for a second, the cardboard box suddenly cold in my hands. Did you just? I started, but he was already answering a phone call, his voice a smooth, professional monotone. I retreated to the elevator, feeling foolish. I was stressed. I had a deadline on the urban planning dissertation, a monstrous 400-page beast filled with soul-crushingly dry syntax. Of course I was seeing patterns where there were none. The brain, under duress, creates its own logic. I tried to put it out of my mind. I called my brother, Liam. He lived out in Mississauga, in a world of lawns and two-car garages that felt a million miles away from my glass tower. "You're overthinking it, Elle," he said, his voice crackling slightly. "It's probably some new TikTok thing. You know, like that weird dance everyone was doing last year. A good luck charm." "But it's precise," I argued, pacing the length of my living room. "It's always 2 taps. Exactly the same rhythm." "Okay, so it's a precise TikTok thing," he chuckled. "People are sheep. You've been cooped up in that apartment too long. You're starting to get weird." He was probably right. I was a professional hermit. My social interactions were largely digital. Of course the real world seemed strange. I resolved to ignore it, to file it away under urban quirks. For a week, I succeeded. I wore noise-canceling headphones while I worked, I turned my music up, I focused on the Oxford commas and dangling participles of my client's work. I was in control. Then I saw it on TV. I was taking a lunch break, watching the national news. A federal minister was at a podium, announcing a new infrastructure grant. She finished her statement, gathered her papers, and just before she turned to walk away, she leaned forward and tapped the podium. Rap rap. The sound was picked up perfectly by the microphone. It was sharp, clear, and utterly intentional. The camera cut back to the news anchor in the studio. She smiled, ready to move to the next story. She lifted her branded mug to her lips, but before she drank, her thumb and forefinger gave the ceramic 2 little taps. Rap rap. My sandwich fell from my hand, landing on the floor with a dull splat. This wasn't a TikTok trend. This wasn't a building quirk. It was everywhere. It was as if humanity had received a software update and I was the only one who hadn't been connected to the network for the download. The sounds of my building took on a new, sinister quality. The quiet was punctuated by the maddeningly rhythmic little knocks. They echoed in the hallways, seeped through my walls. Rap rap from the elevator button panel. Rap rap on a car door in the concrete tomb of the parking garage. Rap rap from the apartment above me, a quick tap tap on the floor before, I assumed, the occupants sat down on their couch. My sanctuary was no longer quiet. It was filled with the sound of a creeping, silent consensus that I was not a part of. My fortress had been breached, not by a shout, but by a whisper, a polite little knock that promised something terrible if you didn't answer. I started to wonder what, exactly, was on the other side of the door. I began to keep a log. A simple notebook, titled The Contagion. The first entry was dated October 12, Mrs. Gable, 2702. 2 knocks on own door before entering. The entries grew, day by day, a catalogue of mundane actions now prefaced by the same 2 beats. October 15, barista at the grind house. Tapped side of debit machine twice before handing it to me. October 19, man on the subway. Tapped the window twice before his stop. October 22, Liam. That was the entry that chilled me. We'd met for our monthly sibling duty coffee. He was telling me about his daughter's soccer tournament. He took a sip of his latte. When he placed the mug back on the saucer, his index finger tapped the ceramic rim. Twice. Rap rap. It was as natural and unconscious as a breath. Did you just do it? I asked, my voice tight. Do what? He looked genuinely confused. The knock. You just tapped your mug. Twice. He stared at me, a flicker of concern in his eyes. What are you talking about? I just put my cup down. He picked it up and put it down again, a perfectly normal motion. See? Nothing. No, you did it. I saw you. You're imagining things, he said, his tone shifting from brotherly concern to frustrated pity. You really need to get out more. This obsession isn't healthy. He didn't see it. He didn't even know he was doing it. The contagion was not just a behavior, it was an invisible one to those who had it. I sat there, across the table from my own brother, and for the first time in my life, I felt utterly, terrifyingly alone. The chasm between us wasn't Mississauga to Toronto, it was one reality to another. He was on one side, tapping his way through the day, and I was on the other, watching, listening, and slowly going mad. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The world didn't just have a new habit, it had a new, unspoken grammar. The double tap was the punctuation mark at the end of every intention. Rap rap before starting a car. Rap rap before opening a laptop. Rap rap before hanging up the phone. It was a silent, syncopated rhythm humming just beneath the surface of everything, and my awareness of it was a curse. My contagion log became my Bible and my tormentor. It was filled with dozens of entries, a frantic scrawl of observations that proved I wasn't crazy, even as the act of recording them made me feel like I was. November 2nd, woman at the self-checkout. Tapped the screen twice before hitting pay. Machine froze. Had to be rebooted. Was it because she did it wrong? Or because I was watching? November 5th, watched an old movie, from the 90s. No one did it. Felt like watching a documentary about a lost civilization. A world without the rhythm. So quiet. My isolation deepened into a state of siege. Conversations became minefields. How do you talk to people about a phenomenon they are unconsciously participating in and are completely blind to? Pointing it out was like trying to describe the color blue to someone who has never had sight. They just tilted their heads, their expressions a placid mixture of confusion and concern for my sanity. I don't know what you mean, Elara. My work, once a refuge, was now a source of anxiety. I was editing a new manuscript, a biography of a Canadian painter. I found myself scanning the text not just for grammatical errors, but for any hint of the contagion. I'd read a sentence like, he would pause at the threshold of his studio, taking a moment to center himself before the canvas, and a cold dread would wash over me. What did center himself mean? Did he knock? Was I editing the past to conform to the present? Desperate for answers, I turned to the internet's dark, dusty corners, the digital attics where forgotten theories and fringe ideas festered. I searched for mass behavioral tics, mimetic contagion, shared unconscious ritual. Most of it was junk science and conspiracy babble. But then I found it. A blog, stark and simple, titled Fractured Consensus. It was run by a man named Dr. Eris Thorne. His posts were dense, esoteric, and utterly terrifying because they made a strange kind of sense. He didn't write about a virus or a government plot. He wrote about reality itself as a form of consensus agreement. He argued that on a fundamental level, the universe requires observation to maintain a stable state, and human consciousness, collectively, provides that observation. What if, he posited, that consensus could be hacked? What if a new, stronger signal could overwrite the old one, subtly altering the source code of what is normal? He called the little glitches syncopations. He theorized that these rituals, these knocks, were synchronization keys, unconscious actions people perform to keep themselves attuned to the dominant reality wave. Failure to sync, he wrote, could lead to perceptual desynchronization. He described it as a subtle friction between the individual and their environment. Objects might not be where you thought you left them. Conversations would have strange, non-sequitur gaps. A sense of being perpetually out of step with the world. It was exactly what I was starting to feel. The secondary mystery he presented was a precursor event he called the silent hum. Years ago, in scattered urban centers, there were reports of a low-frequency hum that only a small percentage of the population could hear. It was dismissed as tinnitus or industrial noise. Thorne believed it was the carrier wave for the new reality, the broadcast signal that had been laying the groundwork for the behavioral change to come. He listed the affected areas. A district in Tokyo. A suburb of Berlin. And a small, specific neighborhood in North Toronto. My old neighborhood. The one I grew up in before moving to the Meridian Tower. I felt a jolt, a connection that was both validating and horrifying. I had heard it. I remembered complaining to my parents about a buzzing sound at night that no one else seemed to notice. They'd told me it was just the hydro lines. I had to contact him. I drafted an email, my fingers trembling. I described my observations, the double knocks, the blank denial from everyone around me. I told him about the hum. I attached a scanned copy of the first few pages of my contagion log. I hit send and felt a surge of hope so fierce it was painful. Maybe, just maybe, I wasn't alone. While I waited for a reply, the world grew more hostile in its quiet apathy. It was a friction, just as Thorne had described. My key fob for the building's front door would sometimes take 2 or 3 tries to register. The automatic doors at the grocery store would hesitate before opening for me, as if they were unsure of my presence. Once, I ordered a coffee, and the barista clean forgot my order a second after I'd made it, turning to the next customer as if I were invisible. It was only when I cleared my throat loudly that she startled, looking at me as if I'd just materialized. "Oh, sorry," she'd said. Zoned out for a sec. But she hadn't zoned out. She'd looked right through me. I began to conduct small, terrifying experiments. I made a point of not performing the ritual. I would open my laptop without the preliminary tap. I would answer my phone without the little beat of acknowledgement. I would walk out my door, my knuckles clenched at my sides in defiance. Each act felt like holding my breath underwater. I was resisting, proving I still had agency, that I wasn't one of them. Nothing catastrophic happened. Just the friction. The little stumbles in the fabric of my day. A package delivered to the wrong floor. An email that vanished from my inbox. A favorite mug that slipped from my grasp for no reason, shattering on the floor. The world was passively-aggressively trying to reject me. A week after I sent my email, a reply from Eris Thorne appeared in my inbox. It was brief. Subject, syncopation query. Ms. Vance. Your log is compelling. The spread is faster than I predicted. Be careful. Observation is not a passive act. You are noticing the seam, and the seam is noticing you back. The hum was the firmware update. The knocking is the ongoing user agreement. You have, for whatever reason, refused to click I agree. Do not attempt to convince the synchronized. You are speaking a dead language to them. Keep logging. But more importantly, watch for increased desynchronization events. And whatever you do, do not lose your keys. A.T. The email was a life raft and an anchor. I wasn't mad. But the truth was infinitely more terrifying. I was speaking a dead language. I was a ghost haunting a world that had moved on without me. I looked at my own hands, resting on the keyboard. They were steady. They didn't feel the need to tap, to knock, to sync. They were my hands, under my control. For now. The isolation was no longer just a feeling, it was a physical law, a property of my existence. I went to the window of my 27th floor apartment and looked out at the city. A billion lights blinked in the encroaching dusk. Behind so many of those windows, people were moving, living, talking. And punctuating their every move was a quiet, constant rhythm. Rap rap. Rap rap. Rap rap. A heartbeat I couldn't feel, a song I couldn't sing. And I was suddenly, terribly afraid of the silence in my own apartment, the silence that proved I was no longer a part of the world outside my window. I was becoming an error in the code. And I had no idea how long the system would tolerate an error before it decided to delete me. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The friction was getting worse. It was like walking through water, the world offering a soft, invisible resistance to my every move. My internet connection would drop during important uploads. My credit card would be declined for no reason, then work perfectly a few minutes later. I started leaving my apartment an extra 15 minutes early for everything, accounting for the desync tax, the little pockets of temporal and physical inconvenience that now plagued my days. Eris Thorne became my only lifeline, a disembodied voice of doom and validation through encrypted emails. He explained his full theory, a chilling blend of quantum physics, memetics, and existential dread. Think of it as a parasitic reality, he wrote. A subtle, opportunistic dimension that has bled through into ours. It doesn't conquer with armies or plagues. It conquers by changing the rules of existence itself, so subtly that people adopt them as their own. The knock is the handshake, the login credential. It attunes the user's biofrequency to the new reality's wavelength. You, Ms. Vance, are still running on the old operating system. Your legacy hardware. And the new software is not backwards compatible. He believed the goal was not malicious, merely complete. The parasitic reality wanted total integration, a seamless overriding of the original. Anything that didn't sync was an anomaly to be smoothed over, ignored, and eventually, phased out. Phased out? I typed back, my hands cold. What does that mean? Phased out how? His reply came hours later. How does a dream phase out when you wake up? It doesn't die. It just stops being real. That sentence haunted my waking hours and stalked my dreams. The stakes escalated in the most personal way imaginable. I had to see Liam. I couldn't accept his digital disappearance into the contagion. I needed to see him in person, to look him in the eye and find my brother again. I arranged to meet him at High Park, thinking the open space, the fresh air, might clear the fog. I got there early, sitting on a bench near the Grenadier Pond. I watched families walk by, couples holding hands. A father, before pushing his daughter on a swing, tapped the chain twice. A young man, before throwing a frisbee, tapped it twice. It was everywhere. A pastoral nightmare. I saw Liam approaching from the path. My heart leaped. He was wearing the blue jacket I got him for his birthday. He looked normal. Liam. I called out, standing up. He kept walking, his gaze sweeping over me as if I were a tree or a lamppost. He didn't slow down. Liam. I shouted, louder this time, a knot of pure ice forming in my stomach. He walked right past my bench. It was as if he hadn't heard me, hadn't seen me. I ran after him, my throat tight with panic. I grabbed his arm. He flinched violently, pulling away from my touch as if he'd been burned. He turned, and the look on his face was not one of recognition. It was the polite, alarmed confusion of a man accosted by a deranged stranger. I'm sorry, he said, his voice wary. Do I know you? Liam, it's me. It's Alara. My voice was a raw, begging sound. It's your sister. He took a half step back, his eyes scanning my face for any hint of familiarity and finding none. Look, I think you have me mistaken for someone else, he said, his tone softening with pity. Are you okay? Do you need help? The world tilted on its axis. He was looking at me, speaking to me, but he was not seeing me. Not my history, not our shared childhood, not the person he had known his entire life. He was seeing a woman, a stranger, a potential problem to be managed. I was phased out. A sudden, desperate thought, a fragment from Thorne's emails, flashed in my mind. The synchronization key. I hadn't been doing it. I had been proudly, stubbornly defiant. And this was the price. I'm sorry, I stammered. Backing away from him. My mistake. I stumbled away, tears blurring the perfect autumn day into a smear of color. I found a public washroom, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I stared at my reflection in the polished steel mirror. I was there. My face was pale, my eyes wide with terror, but it was me. I was real. But was I? With a trembling hand, I reached out and tapped the cool metal of the sink dispenser. Twice. Rap rap. The gesture felt alien, a betrayal of my own mind. It was a surrender. I took a deep, shuddering breath and walked back outside, my heart hammering against my ribs. I saw Liam, standing awkwardly by the path, looking around as if he was waiting for someone. Liam. I called out, my voice barely a whisper. This time, he turned. His face broke into a familiar, relieved smile. Elle. There you are. I was starting to think you'd stood me up. I was looking all over for you. The relief was so absolute it made me nauseous. He saw me. He knew me. I was back. Sorry, I said, my voice shaking. I just got turned around. You okay? You look like you've seen a ghost, he said, giving my shoulder a friendly squeeze. Something like that, I murmured. The walk was torture. I had to force myself to be normal, to talk about his daughter's soccer and my work, while every cell in my body screamed. I had found the light switch. I could flip myself back into his reality. But knowing that the switch existed, that my very recognition was conditional on a simple, mindless ritual, was a horror beyond anything I could have imagined. My defiance wasn't strength, it was a toggle for my own erasure. When I got back to my apartment building, the key fob worked on the first try. The elevator doors slid open the moment I approached. The world was welcoming me back. Because I had complied. I had a video call with Thorne that night. I told him what happened with Liam. He wasn't surprised. He was a disheveled, paranoid man, his eyes darting around his own room as if he expected the walls to be listening. The desynchronization is accelerating, he said, his voice a frantic whisper. It's becoming binary. You're either in the sync, or you're in the static. There's no middle ground left. Before, it was friction. Now, it's exclusion. So what do I do? I asked, desperate. Just knock. For the rest of my life. Become one of them. It's the only way to remain real in this consensus, he admitted. But there might be another way. A dangerous one. I've been working on a counter-frequency. A signal that could disrupt the broadcast, create a pocket of the old reality. A sanctuary. But the feedback could be unpredictable. It could collapse the local consensus entirely. Or it could just wipe out the person broadcasting it. A sanctuary. A place where I wouldn't have to knock. A place where I could be recognized unconditionally. It was a fool's hope, but it was the only one I had. What do you need? I asked. I need a node in a high-density area. A place with a strong connection to the network. Your tower, it's perfect. A giant antenna. He promised to send me the schematics for a device I could build from parts one could order online. A way to fight back. For the next few days, I lived a double life. Outwardly, I complied. I tapped my mug. I tapped my phone. I tapped my door. Rap rap. Each time, a piece of me shriveled and died, but the world remained smooth and accommodating. Liam called and chatted normally. My clients paid their invoices on time. I was a functioning member of the new society. But inside my apartment, I was assembling Thorne's device, a strange contraption of copper wire, circuit boards, and a modified signal booster. It was my secret rebellion, my hope for escape. I was becoming one of them to save myself from them. The paradox was eating me alive. Every compliant rap made the world accept me more, and me accept myself less. I was knocking on the door to my own prison, and the most terrifying part was that with every tap, the lock on the inside was beginning to feel more and more like home. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The device was finished. It sat on my coffee table. A grotesque sculpture of wires and solder, its small LED blinking a hopeful, defiant green. Thorne's instructions were clear: place it near a window, point it towards the densest part of the city, and activate it. He called it the harmonic resonator. He believed it would broadcast a disruptive signal, a white noise, on the reality frequency, creating a small, stable pocket of the old world. A sanctuary, just for me. He would activate his own at the same time, miles away, hoping our two small notes could create a chord of resistance. The morning I planned to activate it was gray and overcast, the sky the color of unpolished steel. I had a final, urgent revision request from my client, the one with the urban planning dissertation. It was due in an hour. A flurry of emails, a frantic search for a misplaced file. My mind was on deadlines and page numbers, on the mundane pressures of the life I was trying to save. Distracted, rushed, I finished the work, attached the file, and hit send. I glanced at the clock. I was late for a coffee meeting I'd scheduled with a potential new client, a meeting I'd set up as part of my compliance persona. I grabbed my bag, my keys, my coat. I pulled open my apartment door and stepped into the hallway, my mind already rehearsing my pitch. And I forgot. In my haste, in my focus on the normal, I forgot the abnormal. I didn't knock. I didn't perform the small, two-beat ritual of surrender. I just walked out. I didn't realize it until I was in the elevator. My neighbor from down the hall, Mr. Chen, got in on the 25th floor. He was a kind man who always offered a quiet nod. Today, he stepped in, faced the doors, and stood in silence. His eyes slid right past me as if the space I occupied was empty air. I was 2 feet away from him, close enough to smell the faint scent of his aftershave, and he gave no sign of my existence. A cold dread, colder and more absolute than anything I had felt before, washed over me. This wasn't the polite non-recognition of Liam in the park. This was total nullification. I stumbled out of the elevator into the lobby. The new concierge, a woman I'd spoken to yesterday, was laughing at something on her phone. She didn't look up. I walked towards the glass doors, which were supposed to slide open automatically. They remained shut. I stood there, invisible to the sensors. A man walked up behind me, and they slid open for him. I slipped through the gap behind him like a ghost. I was in the static. I ran to my usual coffee shop, a desperate, illogical hope that familiarity would tether me to reality. The place was bustling. I stood at the counter. The barista looked over my head, past my shoulder, through my chest. Next, she called out. The man behind me stepped forward and placed his order. I waved my hand in front of the barista's face. Nothing. I was a glitch, an artifact. I was not there. The world was utterly, seamlessly, horrifically continuing on without me. People sidestepped the empty space where I stood, their paths diverging around me without a conscious thought, like water flowing around a stone. I wasn't invisible, I was conceptually irrelevant. Panic, pure and primal, seized me. I ran. I ran back towards the Meridian Tower, my silent screams swallowed by the city's drone. I had to get back to my apartment. To the device. To my sanctuary. The front doors were closed. The concierge couldn't see me. I waited, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs, until someone else entered and I could slip in behind them. I got to the elevator. I got to the 27th floor. I stood before my door. 2704, home. My key fob. I fumbled for it in my pocket, my hand shaking so badly I could barely grip it. I held it up to the sensor. The light stayed red. I tried again. Red. I jammed it against the sensor, again and again. Red. 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 Of course. The lock was part of their world, the new world. And I was no longer a valid user. I pressed my ear against the cold wood of the door. I could hear it. The faint, familiar hum of my own refrigerator. My life was in there. My books, my computer, my bed. The device. My only hope. All of it, just inches away, on the other side of a barrier I could no longer cross. I sank to the floor, my back against my own door, a castaway on the shores of my own life. I was utterly, completely locked out. Thorn's warning echoed in my mind. Do not lose your keys. I hadn't lost them. They had lost me. This was the confrontation. Not with a monster or a villain. But with a door. With a choice. I could stay here, in the hallway. A ghost haunting my own life, free in my defiance, but intangible, irrelevant, and utterly alone until my consciousness faded into the static. I could be an unheard scream in an empty room. Or I could surrender. I looked at my hand. My knuckles. It was the only key I had left. With a slowness that felt like the movement of continents, I got to my feet. I faced the door. This wasn't a ritual to fit in. This was a plea for re-entry. A desperate prayer to a system I despised. It was the ultimate act of self-betrayal, and the only act of self-preservation left to me. My hand felt heavy, an alien thing at the end of my arm. I raised it. I hesitated, my entire being, my memory of the old world, my stubborn, useless pride, screaming in protest. Then, I knocked. Rap rap. The sound was pathetic in the quiet hallway. An admission of defeat. I waited a second, my breath held tight in my chest. I lifted the key fob again, my hand trembling. I held it to the sensor. The light blinked. And turned green. The click of the lock disengaging was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I pushed the door open and stumbled inside. Everything was as I had left it. My coat was still slung over the chair. The client's email was still on my screen. And on the coffee table, the harmonic resonator sat, its little green light blinking, a monument to a rebellion that had failed before it had even begun. I walked over to it. I looked at its intricate, useless wiring. My sanctuary. My prison break. I reached out and, with one finger, I switched it off. The green light died. I went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. I lifted it to my lips. My hand stopped. On its own, my index finger moved, tapping the side of the glass. Twice. Rap rap. The gesture was smooth, unconscious, and deeply, deeply familiar. I took a sip. The water was cool and clean. I walked to the window and looked out at the city, at the thousands of other windows in the towers around me, each one a tiny world held in the same quiet, rhythmic trance. I wondered how many others had fought it. I wondered if anyone else had stood in the static, on the edge of non-existence. Or had they all just agreed to the terms and conditions without reading them? It didn't matter. I was inside now. I was safe. I was real. I was part of the pattern. The silence that followed the taps was the most comforting sound I had ever known. The quiet contagion, welcome to Tuesday. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The first crack in my world appeared on a morning that should have been a Tuesday. I know it should have been. Monday had been a slog of server migrations and password resets. I'd gone to bed with the specific, leaden exhaustion that only a Monday can induce, my mind already preloading the tasks for the following day, the 10 a.m. team huddle, the patch deployment for the accounting software, the promise of a mediocre but necessary flat white from the cafe opposite the office. Tuesday things. I woke to the familiar Manchester drizzle pattering against my windowpane, a gentle, grey percussion that had been the soundtrack to most of my 34 years. My alarm was chirping. I slapped it off and squinted at the screen. Wednesday, October 18th. 7 o'clock. I stared at it, a knot of confusion tightening in my gut. Wednesday. I sat up, the duvet pooling around my waist. I never slept through a day. Not ever. I'm Leo Vance, a creature of meticulous habit. I work in IT support for a mid-sized legal firm in spinning fields. My life is a structured network of routines, dependencies, and logical sequences. A lost day is a critical system failure. I grabbed my phone, scrolling back through the calendar. Monday the 16th was there, filled with its grim appointments. Then. Wednesday the 18th. The 17th was simply gone. Not blank, not grayed out. It didn't exist. Like a line of code deleted so cleanly you couldn't even see the space where it used to be. A hangover? I'd had 2 pints at the Marble Arch with my mate Colin on Sunday, but that was it. A fugue state. Stress. My job was a pressure cooker of other people's technological incompetence, but it had never made me lose time. I shook my head, the motion feeling sluggish, and swung my legs out of bed. My flat, a neat box in a converted mill in the northern quarter, was exactly as I'd left it. The mug for my evening chamomile tea was on the coaster. The spine of my book was cracked on the bedside table. No signs of a lost 24 hours. The rational part of my brain, the part that debugs error messages for a living, offered the most likely explanation: I'd misremembered. Monday had been so awful it felt like 2 days. I was stressed, tired, and had simply gotten my days of the week scrambled. It was embarrassing, but plausible. I showered, dressed, and caught the tram at Piccadilly Gardens. The air was thick with the smell of wet pavement and diesel fumes. Everything was normal. Too normal. The tram lurched forward, its electronic sign blinking, Wednesday, October 18th. The Metro newspaper, discarded on the seat opposite, screamed a headline about a council tax hike. Date stamped, Wednesday. A woman next to me was on the phone. "No, I can't do Friday," she said, her voice sharp. "I'm completely swamped after the Monday backlog." After the Monday backlog. The phrase snagged in my mind. That's what you say on a Tuesday. I got off at St. Peter's Square and walked the rest of the way. The city was its usual self, a frantic ballet of briefcases, backpacks, and umbrellas. Yet a profound sense of dislocation settled over me. It felt like watching a film where a single frame was missing. You might not consciously notice it, but your brain knows something is out of sequence. At the office, the air smelled of stale coffee and industrial-grade air freshener. My closest colleague, Sarah, was already at her desk, typing furiously. "Morning," I said, shrugging off my damp coat. "Brutal Monday, wasn't it? Feels like it took a whole day to recover." I was fishing, casting a line into the sea of her reality to see what I'd pull back. She glanced up, her brow furrowed slightly. "Monday? Yeah, it was busy. You look a bit rough, Leo. Everything okay?" "Fine, just a bit disoriented. Feels weird that it's already Wednesday." Sarah laughed, a short, sharp sound. "I wish. Imagine skipping a day of this." "What are you on about?" "It is Wednesday." "No, I mean," I struggled, the words feeling thick and stupid in my mouth. "Skipping yesterday. You know. Tuesday." She stopped typing. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard. She looked at me not with confusion, but with the kind of pitying concern you'd give a senile relative. Leo, what's a Tuesday? The question was so simple, so absurdly fundamental, that it poleaxed me. For a moment, I thought it was a joke. A new bit of office slang I'd missed. What do you mean, what's a Tuesday? I chuckled, but the sound was thin. It's the day. The day after Monday. The day after Monday is Wednesday, she said, her tone slow and deliberate, as if explaining to a child. Are you having me on? No. Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, I trailed off. The look on her face wasn't playful. It was a mask of genuine, uncomprehending blankness. It was the face of someone being told the sky was green. Right, she said, turning back to her screen, a subtle act of dismissal. Well, could you look at Mr. Henderson's laptop when you're settled? He says his emails have gone all wobbly. I retreated to my desk, my heart hammering against my ribs. My own monitor glowed with the company intranet homepage. A cheerful banner read, "Happy Hump Day, everyone." This had to be a prank. A massively coordinated, incredibly cruel prank. I opened a browser and typed Tuesday into the search bar. The results were a jumble of nonsense. Typos for Tuesday, a Hungarian surname. A link to a song by an obscure band called The Lost Day. A few genealogical records for a family named Tuesday. But nothing about the day of the week. Not Wikipedia, not a dictionary definition, not a single article. It was as if the word had been scrubbed from the digital universe. My hands started to shake. I typed days of the week. Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. 6 days. The articles I found discussed the 6-day week as a historical constant, tracing its origins back through various cultures, none of which ever had a 7th day squeezed between the 1st and 3rd. I felt a wave of vertigo. I stood up and walked to the kitchenette, needing to do something physical. Another colleague, Dave from marketing, was making tea. "All right, Leo," he asked cheerfully. "Dave," I began, trying to keep my voice level. "Quick, stupid question. Can you name the days of the week for me?" He grinned. "Bit early for a sobriety test, isn't it? Monday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday. There. Can I have my prize?" "There's one missing," I said, my voice barely a whisper. Dave's grin faltered. "Missing? No, that's all of them. Always has been. Are you sure you're all right, mate? You look like you've seen a ghost." I hadn't seen a ghost. I'd seen the space where a ghost used to be. I spent the rest of the day in a fugue of quiet terror, fixing wobbly emails and resetting passwords on autopilot. Every casual mention of yesterday, meaning Monday, or the other day, sent a fresh spike of anxiety through me. No one else noticed the gap. The world had seamlessly stitched itself together around a wound I was convinced I could see. That evening, I didn't go home. I went to a Waterstones and bought a thick, unlined moleskine notebook and a pack of fine-tipped pens. I found a quiet corner in a pub and ordered a pint I didn't touch. I opened the notebook to the first crisp, cream-colored page. Under the dim, amber light, my hand shaking slightly, I wrote my first entry. My name is Leo Vance. Today is Wednesday, October 18th. But I am certain that yesterday, October 17th, existed. It was a Tuesday. The day of the week between Monday and Wednesday. No one else remembers it. They think I'm mad. I'm not mad. I am writing this down so I don't forget. Tuesday was real. The ink looked stark and defiant on the page. It was my anchor. My proof. As long as I had this, I wasn't crazy. The world was. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The week crawled by in its new, truncated 6-day rhythm. I lived in a state of hypervigilance, my senses pricked for the next inconsistency, the next tear in the fabric. I became an archaeologist of the immediate past, sifting through conversations for relics of lost concepts. My colleagues started giving me a wide berth. My silences were too long, my stares too intense. Worried about Leo became a hushed topic of conversation around the water cooler. I was becoming the office eccentric, the man who was quietly, undramatically, losing his mind. My isolation deepened. How do you explain to someone that they've forgotten a fundamental building block of reality? Every attempt was a dead end. "Mom," I'd said over the phone, my voice tight. "When I was a kid, do you remember what day the bins went out?" "The morning after Monday, love." "Wednesday," she'd replied, her tone laced with a gentle confusion. "Why are you asking such a funny thing?" "No, but there was another day. We used to call it bin day. It had another name." "I don't think so, Leo. Are you eating properly?" The conversation always circled back to my well-being. My sanity was the variable, not the world. My notebook became my only confidant. Each night, I'd fill its pages with frantic, detailed accounts. The texture of the lost day, the specific feeling of it, less grim than Monday, less hopeful than Wednesday, a day of quiet industry. I wrote about the rhythms of Tuesdays past, the double-length lectures at university, the specific TV shows that used to air. Top Gear. That was a Tuesday show. I searched for it online. The show existed, of course, but the broadcast histories listed it as airing on Wednesdays. All of them. Every season. My own memory was being gaslit by the entire internet. Then, about 2 weeks after the first Wednesday, the second domino fell. It was a Saturday. I was in the Arndale Center, adrift in the sea of shoppers. A charity worker with a clipboard and a bright tabard stepped in front of me. "Got a minute to help save the polar bears?" she asked, her smile relentlessly cheerful. "Sorry, bit tight on cash this month," I mumbled, trying to sidle past. "No worries. Every little helps. Just think, by the time Christmas rolls around, you could have helped save a whole family." The word snagged. Christmas. It sounded odd. Vaguely familiar but lacking its usual resonance, like a word in a foreign language you only half remember. Christmas. I repeated. The charity worker's smile didn't waver. "Yeah, the big one. You know, turkey, presents, family rows." "Right, yeah," I said, a cold sweat breaking out on my neck. "Of course. When is that again?" She looked at me as if I'd asked her to explain gravity. "The 25th of December. Are you joking?" I wasn't. The date, December 25th, meant nothing to me. It was just a number. But I knew, with a certainty that defied my own failing memory, that I should know it. There was an enormous, glittering, pine-scented hole in my mind where a lifetime of Christmases used to be. I could remember cold weather, twinkly lights, the taste of mulled wine, but the central pillar of the memory, the day, the name, the reason, was gone. I stumbled away, leaving the charity worker staring after me. I rushed home, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I tore open my notebook. The word Christmas floated in my head, detached from all meaning. I wrote it down, again and again. Christmas. Christmas. It was a holiday. The biggest one. Winter. Jesus. Birth. The words felt like gibberish. The next morning, I checked the notebook. The page where I'd written about Tuesday was different. The ink was paler, the lines less distinct. The word Tuesday was a faint, gray smudge, as if the paper was actively trying to absorb and digest it. My heart seized. I flipped to last night's entry. The frantic scrawls about Christmas were also faded, but more alarmingly, some words were warped. The word Jesus had bled into a meaningless blotch. The paper wasn't just a passive record. It was a battleground. And I was losing. My research grew more desperate. I scoured fringe forums and conspiracy websites, searching for any mention of memory loss, shifting realities, lost days. I found plenty of madness, lizard people, flat earthers, chemtrail believers, but nothing that matched the quiet, specific nature of my experience. It was a contagion of subtraction, not addition. That's when I started noticing him. The old man on the 142 bus, the one that runs the length of Oxford Road. He was there every time I took it, which I started doing deliberately, abandoning the tram. He was maybe 70, with a wild mane of white hair and a coat that had seen better decades. He never looked at his phone. He just stared out of the window. But it was how he stared that caught my attention. His gaze was fixed, intense, as if he wasn't looking at the buildings but at the spaces between them. And sometimes, he'd lift a trembling finger and trace patterns on the steamed-up glass. They weren't words or pictures. They were strange, looping sigils, complex and momentary. He'd trace one, stare at it for a second, and then wipe it away with the heel of his palm. Was he like me? A fellow rememberer? Or was he something else? A symptom? A cause? He became my secondary mystery, a single, flickering data point in a sea of static. The next loss was the Blitz. I was at the pub with Colin, who had apparently decided to take my weirdness as a personal project. He was trying to draw me out. Saw a documentary last night, he said over the noise. About the war. The big one. Crazy stuff. All that fighting in France, the Normandy landings. What about the home front? I asked, my voice carefully neutral. The bombing raids on cities like Manchester, London. Colin frowned. Bombing raids? Here. Nah. The Germans never made it across the channel. That was the whole point, wasn't it? Our navy was too strong. Another tectonic plate of my reality shifted. The Blitz, the defining myth of modern Britain, the spirit of resilience, the images of St. Paul's wreathed in smoke, had been deleted. I felt a phantom memory of my granddad telling me stories, of the air raid shelter at the bottom of his garden. The memory was a ghost limb, still aching where it had been amputated. I excused myself, claiming a headache. I went home and wrote it all down. The Blitz. German bombing campaign. 1940-41, keep calm and carry on. I wrote with a desperate ferocity, trying to carve the concepts into the paper, to brand them onto the page. The next morning, the words were barely there. Blitz was a faint blur. German was a spiderweb of gray. The notebook was failing. The contagion wasn't just in people's minds. It was in the world itself. It was an anti-reality, actively unwriting its own past. And on the bus that afternoon, I saw the old man again. He wasn't tracing on the window. He was holding a small, worn leather-bound book, almost identical to my Moleskine. He wasn't writing in it. He was just holding it, his thumb stroking the cover, a look of profound, sorrowful peace on his face. He looked up and our eyes met. For a single, terrifying second, I saw a flicker of recognition in his gaze. Not of me, Leo Vance. But of a fellow traveler. He gave a slow, almost imperceptible nod. Then he looked away, back to the spaces between the buildings, as the world outside the window shimmered, just for a moment, like heat haze on a cold day. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The hum started subtly. A low-frequency thrum at the edge of my hearing, the kind of sound you can feel in your teeth. I first noticed it in the dead of night, when the city's usual symphony of sirens and distant traffic had faded. It was a clean, pure tone, like a server farm hidden beneath my floorboards. I tried to trace it, pressing my ear to walls, to the windowpane, but it was sourceless. It was everywhere. The shimmer became more frequent, too. A momentary distortion in the air, like watching the world through a sheet of falling water. A lamppost would seem to bend for a fraction of a second. The sharp corner of a building would blur into an impossible curve. It was peripheral, always gone when I tried to focus on it, leaving me with a dizzying sense of retinal burn-in. My notebook was a graveyard. Each new entry was a frantic, short-lived monument to a dying concept. The Beatles. A few days after I wrote their name, I overheard someone at work talking about a legendary 60s band from Liverpool called The Quarrymen, who had a string of minor hits before breaking up. Shakespeare. His plays were still there, but they were now attributed to a collective of Elizabethan playwrights. The man himself was a footnote, possibly a myth. The contagion was accelerating. It wasn't just erasing things, it was patching the holes with plausible, drabber alternatives. History was being subtly rewritten, its vibrant colors fading to gray. The world was becoming less interesting, less textured. I knew I had to talk to the old man from the bus. He was my only lead. Following him felt like the height of paranoia, a trench-coated cliché, but I was out of options. One afternoon, I got off at the same stop he did, trailing him at a distance through the red brick terraces of Rusholme. He moved with a slow, steady purpose, ending up at a small, cluttered terraced house with peeling paint and overgrown rose bushes. I waited for an hour, my nerves screaming, before I walked up the cracked path and knocked on the door. It opened a moment later. He stood there, the same wild white hair, the same ancient coat, even indoors. His eyes, pale blue and watery, fixed on me. "I was wondering when you'd come," he said. His voice was a dry rustle. "You know why I'm here?" I asked, my own voice trembling. "I know the look," he said, stepping back to let me in. The look of a man trying to hold on to smoke. "Come in. My name is Arthur." His house was a museum of clutter. Books stacked in precarious towers, yellowed newspapers tied with string. Strange mechanical contraptions made of clock parts and copper wire. The air was thick with the smell of dust, old paper, and something else, ozone, like the air after a lightning strike. The hum was stronger here. "You feel it, don't you?" Arthur said, gesturing to a worn armchair. "The quiet. The great unhappening. What is it?" I blurted out, pulling my moleskine from my jacket pocket like a talisman. "A signal? Some kind of weapon?" Arthur let out a dry chuckle. "A weapon has a purpose, a wielder. This is more like entropy. The universe tidying up. Getting rid of unnecessary complexity. Redundant data." He tapped his temple. "We are the redundant data, you and I. The ones with the faulty cache." He saw my notebook. A flicker of something, pity, perhaps, crossed his face. "Ah. You're still fighting it. Still writing it down." "It's the only way to remember," I said, my voice defensive. "But it's not working. The words, they fade." "Of course they do," he said, as if explaining a simple law of physics. "You're trying to write on water. The medium itself is compromised. The quiet isn't just in our heads, son. It's in the paper, in the ink, in the air. It unmakes things. To remember a thing that has been erased is to create a paradox. And the universe does not like a paradox." He walked over to a dusty canvas propped against a wall and turned it around. It was blank. Perfectly, unervingly white. "This is my work now," he said. "I used to be a painter. Portraits. Landscapes. Now. I paint what is. I paint the gaps." This wasn't the ally I had hoped for. This wasn't a resistance fighter. He was a collaborator. A willing witness to oblivion. "So you're just letting it happen?" I asked, aghast. "Letting it?" He turned his pale eyes on me, and for the first time I saw an immense, crushing weariness in them. "I fought it for 20 years. 20 years of notebooks like yours, full of ghosts. I remembered the Cold War, the moon landing, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Each one a jewel, a treasure. And I watched each one dissolve into dust. Do you know what it costs, Leo? To be the sole curator of a dead museum? To carry the weight of a world that no one else misses because they don't even know it was here? He took a shaky breath. There is a peace in letting go. An unburdening. It will come for us all eventually. The quiet will smooth us out. It will take our jagged edges, our painful specifics, and make us simple. Make us blank. He pointed a trembling finger at my notebook. That book is an anchor. It's keeping you in the storm. It's what's causing the shimmer, the hum you feel. You are a point of resistance, and the universe is pressing back against you. The more you write, the harder it will press. It will start taking bigger things. It will take people. A shard of ice slid down my spine. A shopkeeper on my street, Mr. Chowdhury, who ran the corner shop. He'd vanished a week ago. The shop was now a vape store with a garish neon sign. No one remembered the gentle old man who sold milk and papers. I tried to write his name down, but the ink had smudged into an illegible tear stain before it even dried. I stood up, backing away from Arthur and his terrifying serenity. No. I won't. I can't. You will, he said, his voice soft and final. Eventually, it will come for something you cannot bear to lose. A person. A memory of your mother's face. Your own name. And you will have a choice. Keep fighting and be erased completely, or let go, and simply be. I fled his house, stumbling out into the grey Manchester afternoon. The world seemed thin, translucent. The hum was a roar in my ears now. Arthur's words echoed in my head. It will take people. I ran, not to my flat, but to my parents' house in Didsbury. I needed to see them. To confirm they were still there, solid and real. I burst through their door without knocking, finding them in the lounge, watching a quiz show. Leo, my mum said, startled. What on earth's the matter? I stared at them, my heart pounding. My father, his face etched with concern. My mother, her hand flying to her chest. They were real. They were here. I needed to see you, I stammered. My father stood up. Son, you're pale as a sheet. We've been worried. Sarah from your office called. She said you've not been yourself. Relief washed over me, so potent it made me weak. But as my mum came over to hug me, I saw it. Over her shoulder, on the mantelpiece, was a collection of family photos. Me as a baby. My graduation. A family holiday in Cornwall. And in the center, a large, silver frame. It was empty. It was a wedding photo. I knew it was. I had a phantom memory of it, of my parents young and smiling, my mother in a white dress, my father in a slightly too large suit. But the image was gone. Just a white cardboard backing. Mum, I whispered, my voice cracking. Your wedding photo. She pulled back, looking at the mantelpiece. She smiled, a gentle, placid smile that was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. Oh, that, she said, her voice full of warmth. That's just where we keep the frame. It's a lovely frame, isn't it? They hadn't just forgotten the photo. They had forgotten the event. They had forgotten they were ever married. They were two people who lived in a house together, who had raised a son together, with no memory of the vow that had started it all. The contagion had eaten the foundation of my own existence. And I knew, with sickening certainty, that my frantic scribbling in my notebook had led it right to my door. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The retreat from my parents' house was a slow, silent horror show. I made my excuses, a sudden migraine, work stress, and left them sitting on the sofa, two friendly strangers sharing a pot of tea. The empty silver frame on the mantelpiece seemed to radiate a cold, white light. My act of remembering, my desperate scribbling, hadn't saved anything. It had acted like a beacon, drawing the attention of the quiet to the very things I held most dear. Arthur was right. I was a paradox, and the universe was pressing back, erasing the concepts that defined me, one by one. I walked home through the darkening city. The hum was no longer a background noise, it was the primary frequency of the world, a resonant tone that vibrated through the soles of my shoes. The shimmers were no longer confined to the periphery. I saw a double-decker bus ahead of me turn translucent for a full second, its passengers skeletal ghosts, before it solidified again. The world was losing its integrity. Or I was. When I got back to my flat, the first thing I did was grab the Moleskine. It felt heavy in my hand, dense with loss. I flipped through the pages. They were a mess of faded gray smudges, blurred ink, and vast, empty spaces where my most cherished memories had been laid to rest. Tuesday. Christmas. The Blitz. The Beatles. Mum and Dad's wedding. Each one a tombstone. I was losing the battle. No, the battle was already lost. The contagion was not an external force I could fight, it was inside me now, a part of my own cognitive processes. I tried to picture my mother's face on her wedding day and came up with a blank. I tried to recall the melody of Hey Jude and heard only static. The memories weren't just inaccessible, they were gone, the neurological pathways cauterized. This was the confrontation. Not with a monster or a villain, but with a choice. I could continue to fight, to write, to resist. I could fill the rest of the notebook with every specific, precious detail of my life I had left. My first pet, a hamster named Scamp. The scar on my knee from falling off a bike. The exact taste of the Vimto lollies we used to buy in the summer. I could document it all, and in doing so, I would be painting a giant target on everything that made me me. The quiet would come for it all, and the resistance would only make the erasure more violent, more complete. Soon it would take my name. Then, the very concept of I would become a blank, a human-shaped hole in the world, until the universe finally tired of the paradox and snuffed me out completely. Or, I could do as Arthur did. I could surrender. I could choose peace. I sat at my desk, the notebook open to a fresh, clean page. The pen was in my hand. For a long moment, I did nothing. I listened to the hum. It didn't sound menacing anymore. It sounded peaceful. Like a mantra. A sound of ultimate simplicity. My hands started to shake. A final, desperate act of rebellion flared within me. I couldn't save the world. I couldn't even save my own past. But maybe I could save myself. Not my memories, but my existence. I put the pen to the paper. I wouldn't write about the past. I would write about the present. A final testament. A single, indelible statement of self. My name is Leo Vance. I wrote the first 4 words, the ink dark and sharp against the cream paper. The hum in the room instantly intensified into a deafening roar. The shimmer was no longer a flicker, the entire room was vibrating, the walls blurring into a vortex of indistinct color and light. It felt like the flat was being torn apart at a molecular level. I gripped the pen tighter, my knuckles white. The paper seemed to resist, the nib dragging as if through thick mud. I focused on the next word, the final, most important one. Vance. V. The pen moved, leaving a faint gray trail. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I looked at my hand. For a terrifying, eternal second, it was transparent. I could see the grain of the wooden desk right through my palm. N. The roar became a piercing shriek. The light in the room dissolved into a painful, brilliant white. The concept of desk and chair and room was coming apart in my mind. There was only the page, the pen, and the final, agonizing effort. I had to finish the name. It was the last thing I was. I don't know if I did. The shriek stopped. The light receded. The hum settled back into its gentle, ambient thrum. I was sitting at my desk. The flat was quiet, bathed in the orange glow of the Manchester streetlights. A notebook lay open in front of me. It was full of faint, meaningless scribbles, like a child's practice book. A few pages had darker marks, but they didn't form any words I recognized. I picked up the pen. It felt comfortable in my hand. I looked at my reflection in the dark window. A man's face stared back. It was a familiar face. My face. But the name attached to it, it felt distant. Like a word I'd read in a book once. Leo, I said aloud. The sound was strange in the quiet room. It didn't feel like my name. It just felt like a sound. I looked out the window. The city was calm. The trams slid by on their metal tracks, their lights serene. It all looked so simple. So peaceful. All the jagged edges felt smooth now. The constant, nagging feeling that something was wrong, it was gone. A profound sense of calm washed over me. The struggle was over. I looked down at the notebook, at the blank page waiting. I felt no urge to write anything down. There was nothing to say. The news was on the small television in the corner, the sound muted. The text scrolling along the bottom of the screen was clear and bright. Welcome to Wednesday. Weather will be mild, with light showers throughout the day. I nodded slowly. Of course. It was Wednesday. It was always Wednesday, now. And that was fine. It was simple. It was quiet. The quiet contagion. The book with no name, Sao Paulo. Phase 1, The Unsettling Mundane. My world was built of paper and ink, bound by glue and thread. The Livraria Sabia wasn't just my business, it was my skeleton, the structure that held my life together. Tucked away on a leafy side street in Vila Madalena, it was a pocket of impossible quiet in the roaring heart of Sao Paulo. The city's relentless pulse, a symphony of honking horns, chattering crowds, and the distant thrum of the metro, was a sea against which my bookstore was a lonely, fortified island. I knew its sounds, the creak of the third floorboard from the entrance, the sigh of the old air conditioner, the gentle rustle of a page turning. These were the constants in a life that had precious few. My name is Alara. I inherited the SIBO from my parents, and with it, their love for the tangible weight of stories. In a city of 20 million souls, my days were small and orderly. I'd arrive as the morning garoa, the city's signature drizzle, misted the streets, the smell of wet pavement and strong coffee hanging in the air. I'd catalog new arrivals, shelve returns, and talk to the regulars who were as much a part of the store's architecture as the dark jacaranda wood shelves. My life was a well-written, if slightly predictable, novel. The change began on a Tuesday. It was a detail out of place, a sentence in the wrong chapter. On the Brazilian literature shelf, between a worn copy of Machado de Assis and a pristine edition of Clarice Lispector, was a book that didn't belong. It was hardcover, bound in a plain, cream-colored fabric that felt like old linen. There was no title on the cover, no author, no publisher's mark. The spine was completely, unervingly blank. I pulled it down. It was heavy, dense. I flipped through the pages. The paper was thick, high quality, the text printed in a simple, elegant serif font. But it was the content that was odd. It seemed to be a novel, but I couldn't grasp a narrative. There were descriptions of light hitting dust motes, the feeling of a cool breeze on skin, fragmented dialogues about forgotten memories. It was abstract, impressionistic. I checked my inventory system. No record. No delivery slip, no trade-in receipt. It had simply appeared. Chalking it up to a distributor's error or a customer leaving it behind, I placed it on the small table by the counter for unsorted stock and thought no more of it. That afternoon, Senor Alves came in. He was a retired history professor, a man who moved with the deliberate pace of someone who has read the end of every story. His eyes, usually scanning the history section, landed on the blank book. He stopped. He didn't walk towards it, he was drawn. "This one," he said, his voice a low, reverent whisper. He picked it up, his knobby fingers tracing the blank cover. "I've been looking for this." "Really?" I was surprised. "I don't even know what it is, senor. There's no title." He smiled, a strange, distant expression. "A title is a cage for the words. This is what I always knew but forgot." The phrase was beautiful, poetic, and utterly nonsensical. But he was a treasured customer. I rang him up for the 15 reis I'd arbitrarily priced it at. He paid without looking at the amount, his gaze fixed on the book in his hands, and left. The transaction felt less like a sale and more like a sacrament. I shook my head, the afternoon sun slanting through the dusty windows. Sao Paulo was full of eccentrics. It was part of its charm. The next morning, it was back. Same shelf, same spot between Machado and Lispector. The same cream-colored, blank-spined book. A cold prickle, small and sharp, ran up my spine. My mind raced. Had Senor Alves returned it? No, he would have said something. Did I have 2 copies? I searched the entire store, even the dusty corners of the stockroom. There were no others. I checked the previous day's sales log. 1 copy, sold to A. Alves. Verified. My heart beat a little faster. It was impossible. A mistake. My mistake. I must be tired, overworked. I'd been having trouble sleeping, the city's hum seeming louder than usual lately. I took the book and, with a sense of defiant practicality, locked it in the bottom drawer of my desk. Out of sight, out of mind. 2 hours later, a university student named Sophia, a regular who mostly bought contemporary poetry, stopped dead in the middle of the aisle. Her eyes were fixed on the empty spot on the shelf. "Where is it?" she asked, a frantic edge to her voice. "Where is what?" "The book. The real one. It was right here." I felt a knot tighten in my stomach. "A blank one? Cream cover?" Her face lit up with an almost painful relief. "Yes. You have it?" Hesitantly, I took the book from my desk drawer. Her reaction was identical to Senor Alves. A gasp of recognition, a touch that was more like a caress. "It tells you," she whispered, clutching it to her chest. "Tells you what?" I asked, my voice thin. "The way things are. The pattern you feel but can't see." She bought it. I sold it to her. My hand trembling slightly as I took her money. I watched her leave, her pace quick, like a pilgrim who had just been handed a map to a holy site. This cycle repeated 5 more times over the next 2 weeks. Each time, the book would reappear on the shelf overnight. Each time, a customer, strangers, regulars, young, old, would find it with the same shocking, instant recognition. Their explanations were always the same, variations on a theme of forgotten knowledge, of finding a text that articulated a truth they felt in their bones but could never name. I felt a growing dread that was hard to define. It wasn't fear of a ghost or a prank. It was the feeling of a fundamental rule of my world, the simple, physical law of objects, being quietly, politely, and persistently violated. The bookstore, my fortress of logic and order, had a subtle fracture in its foundation, and I could feel a strange draft blowing through. After the 7th sale and subsequent reappearance, I decided I couldn't sell it again. This copy was mine. That night, with the metal grate pulled down over the shop entrance and the city's nocturnal energy humming around me, I sat at my desk and opened the book. I tried to read it from the beginning. A paragraph described the texture of old wood. I read it twice. The first time, it mentioned the grain like a dried riverbed. The second time, I could have sworn it read the grain like a silent map. I blinked, read it a third time. Now it was the grain where time had left its signature. The words weren't just unstable, they were actively resisting being known. I flipped ahead. I found a passage with a character, a woman named Livia walking by the sea. I was drawn in by the beautiful prose. I read for 10 minutes, then looked up, disoriented. I looked back down to find the passage. It was gone. In its place was a description of a room filled with rain. There was no Livia. No sea. Then I noticed something even more disturbing. I scanned the pages for proper nouns. I found a Rua Augusta, a Parque Ibirapura. But when I tried to find a person's name, there were none. There were only the man, the woman, the child, the old one. I flipped back to where I thought I had seen the name Livia. The page now read, "The woman walked where the water met the land." The book was not just shifting. It was erasing. It was stripping away the specific, the individual, leaving only the archetypal, the abstract. I slammed it shut, my heart pounding. The quiet of the bookstore suddenly felt menacing, heavy. It wasn't a sanctuary anymore. It was the heart of the anomaly. I was no longer a simple bookseller. I was the custodian of a quiet contagion. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The next month was a descent into a private, creeping madness. I started a journal, a simple black moleskine, in an attempt to anchor my own mind. My entries began as factual observations. October 17th, book reappeared. Did not shelve it. Kept it under the counter. A man in a business suit stood by the Brasiliana section for 20 minutes, just staring at the empty space. He didn't ask for it. He just seemed disappointed. He left without buying anything. October 22nd, saw Senor Alves at a cafe near Praca Benedito Calixto. He wasn't reading. He was holding a single sugar cube, turning it over and over, his lips moving silently. I got close enough to hear. He was muttering, "The facets hold the sweetness. The facets hold the light." It was a line I'd half remembered from my own attempt to read the book. October 29th, a woman on the metro, listening to music. Her head was tilted, eyes closed. I heard her say, clear as day, over the screech of the train, "The echo arrives before the sound." The man next to her didn't even flinch. The phrases were everywhere now. Ethereal and nonsensical, they were becoming a new kind of street poetry, a secret language spreading through the city. They were spoken with a placid certainty that was far more unnerving than any fanaticism. When someone uttered one, their eyes would glaze over for a moment, as if they were accessing a different stream of reality. My isolation deepened. How do you explain to someone that the world is being subtly rewritten by a book that has no stable text? I tried, once. I called my cousin, Ricardo, in Rio. "Elara, are you okay?" he'd asked, his voice thick with concern. "You sound stressed. Maybe you need a break from the SIBO." "No, you don't understand," I insisted, my voice rising. "People are saying things, Ricardo. Strange things. Like they're all reading from the same script." "What things?" I quoted one I'd heard that morning, "The shadow is the shape of what is absent." There was a long pause on the line. "That's poetic, I guess," he said slowly. "Lara, seriously. Are you writing a novel? Is this some kind of performance art thing?" The conversation ended with his patronizing advice to get more sleep. I hung up, the phone feeling cold and heavy in my hand. He hadn't just dismissed me, he had pathologized my perception. The contagion wasn't just spreading, it was insulating itself with the disbelief of the unaffected. I was the one who sounded crazy. I was the broken one. I stopped talking about it. Instead, I observed. I watched. My journal became my only confidant, its pages filling with my spidery, increasingly frantic handwriting. The people who had bought the book were the primary vectors, but it was spreading beyond them now, as if through sheer proximity. They didn't talk to each other, they talked past each other, contributing their fragments to a collective, ambient monologue. The dust remembers the footstep. The rust is the color of a story ending. The silence between breaths is the true conversation. My bookstore became a nexus. People would wander in, not to browse, but to stand. They would drift through the aisles, their hands ghosting over the spines of normal books, their expressions serene and vacant. They were waiting. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, that they were waiting for me to put the book back on the shelf. The copy I kept locked away felt heavier each day, a dark star pulling the city's lost souls into its orbit. It was during this time that Dr. Mendez started visiting. He was a small, neat man, an academic from USP whose field was narrative archaeology, the study of stories and myths that vanish from cultures. He was looking for records of forgotten Tupi legends, oral histories that had died out. He was my last hope for an ally. For weeks, he was just another researcher, another fascinating customer. He'd speak of semantic voids, places in history where a concept or a story simply ceased to be. Imagine, he said one afternoon, sipping the small cup of cafezinho I'd offered him, if we all forgot the word blue. Not just the word, but the concept. The sky would still be the same color, but we would have no way to perceive it, to share it. It would become a hole in our reality. History is full of these little holes. My hand was shaking. What if something was creating new holes? I asked, my voice barely a whisper. Or, filling them with something else. He looked at me, his scholarly curiosity piqued. An interesting thought. A mimetic parasite. Something that replaces established meaning. Why do you ask? My heart hammered against my ribs. This was it. The moment of truth. I could retreat back into my silent paranoia, or I could risk everything and show him. The fear of being thought insane warred with the desperate need to be understood. I took a deep breath. I have something to show you, I said, and unlocked the bottom drawer of my desk. Before I could show him the book, however, the secondary mystery I hadn't even realized was a mystery began to unfold. It started with my own memories. Small things at first. I couldn't remember my grandmother's maiden name. I stared at a photograph of her, the face so familiar, but the name was a perfect, smooth blank in my head. I tried to make pão de queijo from my mother's recipe, a ritual I'd performed 1,000 times, but I found myself staring at the ingredients, unable to recall the sequence of steps. At first, I blamed the stress. But then I noticed it in the world. On the news, a politician referred to a famous historical event, but got the year wrong. Not by a little, but by a century. The news anchor didn't correct him. The cheering beneath confirmed the wrong date. I scrambled for a history book. The book, a standard text I'd had for years, now listed the new, incorrect date. My world wasn't just being overwritten with new, poetic nonsense. It was being subtly, surgically edited. History, memory, fact, it was all becoming as fluid and unreliable as the text in the blank book. The contagion wasn't just adding a new layer to reality. It was hollowing out the old one from the inside. And as I finally placed the cream-colored book on the counter in front of the fascinated Dr. Mendez, I had the terrifying realization that I was no longer sure which memories, which facts, were ever real to begin with. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. Dr. Mendez did not call me crazy. He did something far worse. He believed me. He stared at the blank-spined book on the counter, his usual academic composure dissolving into a raw, undisguised awe. He handled it like a radioactive artifact, with a reverence that bordered on fear. My God, he breathed, tracing the cover. It's not just a mimetic parasite. It's a source code. It's an engine for generating a new reality. For the next week, the Livraria Sabia became our laboratory. By day, I ran the shop, selling normal books to an increasingly distracted populace. By night, Mendez and I would pore over the book. We couldn't study it in any traditional sense. It was impossible to photocopy, the pages came out blank. Impossible to photograph, the images were blurred light. Mendez tried to transcribe it, but his notes would contradict each other within minutes. A sentence he wrote down would seem alien to him an hour later, as if penned by another hand. His theory was terrifying. The book, he posited, wasn't from our reality. It was an artifact, or a seed, from another. One that operated on different principles, where narrative wasn't a description of reality, but its foundation. Think of it, Elara, he explained, his eyes wide with a terrifying intellectual fever. Our reality is based on physics. Cause and effect. Theirs is based on aesthetics. On story. What is most resonant, most poetic, becomes true. It's not erasing our world, it's overriding it with a more beautiful version. More meaningful. But it's a meaning we can't use. It's the meaning of a dream. The escalation was no longer subtle. Communication breakdown was becoming the norm. I went to the bakery to buy bread. "Biomgia," I said to the woman behind the counter. She smiled serenely, her eyes unfocused, and replied, "The heat awakens the grain." I stood there, holding my money, but she made no move to serve me. I asked again, "I'd like 2 pains franceses, please." She just tilted her head. The hunger is a question the bread answers. I left without the bread. The transaction had failed because we were no longer using the same protocols. My language, based on practical exchange, was obsolete. Hers, based on the book's gnomic prose, was the new currency. Sao Paulo was fracturing into 2 distinct species, those who spoke Portuguese, and those who spoke the book. The environmental warping grew more pronounced. It was no longer confined to my peripheral vision. One afternoon, standing at a crosswalk on Avenida Paulista, I watched a stream of traffic pass. For a split second, the cars weren't cars. They were a river of solid, metallic shapes, flowing without drivers, their headlights like the phosphorescent eyes of deep-sea fish. The illusion, or reality, held for 3 heartbeats and then shattered back into normal cars, honking and fuming. I felt a wave of vertigo so intense I had to grip a lamppost to keep from falling. I looked at the faces of the people around me. No one else seemed to have noticed. They were all staring at their phones, or at the sky, or at nothing, their faces placid. My temporary alliance with Dr. Mendez began to fray. The very thing that made him my ally, his intellectual curiosity, became his undoing. He wasn't just studying the book, he was absorbing it. He started quoting it, not for my benefit, but reflexively. While trying to analyze a shifting passage, he murmured, "The archive of dust holds every path." He didn't seem to realize he'd said it. The breaking point came a week later. I arrived at the shop to find him sitting in my chair, the book open before him. He wasn't reading it. He was just looking at it, his finger tracing a sentence that I knew would be different if I looked away and looked back. "Mendez?" I said softly. He looked up, but his eyes didn't focus on me. They looked through me. "The door is the frame for the leaving," he said, his voice calm and even. "Dr. Mendez, please," I begged, tears welling in my eyes. "Listen to me. You have to stop. It's changing you." "Change?" He smiled, a beatific, empty smile that sent a spike of pure ice through my veins. "No. Not change. Return. The story is finding its proper shape." He was lost. My one ally, the one person who saw what I saw, had crossed the border and wasn't coming back. He had become one of them. He stood up, left the book on the desk, and walked out of the Livraria Sabia without a backward glance, leaving me utterly, terrifyingly alone. The silence he left behind was louder than the city's roar. The stakes were no longer academic. The world was becoming actively hostile to the uninfected. Not with violence, but with a quiet, inexorable logic. Automatic doors failed to open for me. My credit card would be inexplicably declined. An elevator would simply not register my floor button. I was becoming incompatible with the new operating system. My continued existence, my adherence to the old rules of reality, was a bug in the code. That night, a small crowd gathered outside the bookstore. They didn't protest or shout. They just stood on the pavement, about 20 of them, bathed in the orange glow of the streetlights. They were all looking at my shop. Some were people I recognized, the student, Sophia, the businessman who had stared at the empty shelf. Others were strangers. They stood in perfect silence, their stillness a stark contrast to the city's usual motion. They weren't threatening. They were waiting. Like a congregation waiting for a church to open. I realized the book didn't need to be sold anymore. It didn't need a vector. It was ambient. The Livraria Sabia, my home, my fortress, had become its temple. And they were waiting for their priestess. With trembling hands, I went to the stockroom. I gathered a small pile of old newspapers and kindling. I took the blank-spined book, the source of it all, and carried it to the small, walled courtyard behind the shop. My plan was simple, primal. Fire. I would burn it. I would burn the source code. I built a small pyre in a metal basin. I placed the book on top. I struck a match, the flare of it seeming impossibly bright in the gathering dark. I touched the flame to the paper. The newspaper caught, curling into black, fragile ashes. The flames licked up, engulfing the book. I waited for the cream-colored cover to blacken, for the pages to curl and burn. Nothing happened. The flames danced around the book, caressing it. The cover remained pristine. The pages did not char. The fire, an elemental force of physics, had no effect on it. The book was not a part of the reality that fire could destroy. As the flames died down, I saw that the heat had done one thing. On the cover, where before there was nothing, a single sentence had appeared, as if tattooed by the fire. It glowed with a faint inner light before fading back to blankness. I read the words, and a cold, final understanding washed over me. It said, "The story cannot be unwritten." Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The confrontation, when it came, was not a battle. It was a surrender. The revelation was not a flash of light, but a slow, quiet flooding of the senses. After the failure of the fire, I retreated into my small apartment above the bookstore. For 2 days, I didn't go down. I listened to the city. The sounds had changed. The chaotic symphony had resolved into something more structured. The drone of traffic had a rhythmic, hypnotic quality. The distant sirens seemed to wail in a recognizable melodic phrase. The cacophony of voices from the street below was no longer a mess of Portuguese, it was a choral tapestry of the book's aphorisms. The window holds the shape of the sky. The key remembers the lock. The road is a promise of elsewhere. My world of cause and effect was dead. A new one, based on metaphor and resonance, had taken its place. My attempt to fight it, to burn the book, was like trying to punch a song. My options had narrowed to a single, terrifying point. Flee. I turned on the television, flipping through international news channels. A broadcaster in London, her face calm and professional, reported on unusual traffic patterns, describing them as a metallic tide seeking its shore. A politician in Tokyo, giving a speech, said, "Our future is a room whose door has not yet been drawn." The contagion wasn't local. Sao Paulo wasn't an isolated outbreak. It was simply one of the places where the new reality had first become legible. There was nowhere to run. Fight? I had tried. Reality itself had rejected my weapon. To fight this was to fight the new nature of existence. It was impossible. That left one path. Adaptation. Or, perhaps, acceptance. On the third morning, I went downstairs. The crowd outside was still there, larger now, but just as silent. They parted for me as I unlocked the metal grate. Their eyes were not vacant anymore, they were expectant. I walked behind the counter, my old bastion. The bookstore was filled with a soft, ambient light that didn't seem to come from the windows or the fixtures. Dr. Mendez was there, standing by the philosophy section. He smiled at me, a genuine, peaceful smile this time. "The last page is a new beginning," he said, and it wasn't a quote. It was a greeting. My old books, the thousands of stories that had been my friends and my defense, seemed like relics from a forgotten civilization. Their narratives felt thin, their characters like faded photographs. They described a world that no longer existed. They were artifacts of a failed reality. On the counter lay the book. Its cream-colored cover seemed to glow with a soft warmth. I was no longer afraid of it. The fear had come from the friction, the resistance between my mind and its truth. Now, exhausted and defeated, I felt no more friction. I picked it up. It felt light in my hands, familiar. I opened it to a random page. The text was no longer shifting in a chaotic, unsettling way. It was fluid, yes, but it moved with the grace of water, forming itself around my perception. I read a line. "The eye does not see the world, but builds it." I looked up from the page. I saw the people in my store, the quiet crowd outside, the city beyond the glass. I was not seeing a world of atomized individuals and random events. I saw the patterns Sophia had mentioned, the connections Mendez had theorized about. I saw the woman by the poetry section, her stillness a counterpoint to the man moving past the window, their paths creating a momentary, perfect symmetry. I saw the light from the street reflecting in a puddle, and understood it not as physics, but as the sky remembering the rain. I wasn't losing my mind. I was being given a new one. A mind that could perceive the universe not as a machine of matter and energy, but as a vast, interconnected, and endlessly meaningful poem. The terror of the unknown was replaced by a profound, terrifying, and liberating sense of belonging. The isolation was over. I was finally learning the language. I stepped out from behind the counter. I walked to the front door of my bookstore and looked out at the city of Sao Paulo. The garoa had started again, the fine mist descending. The world was washed in gray, but it was a luminous, resonant gray, full of stories. I was no longer Ilara, the lonely bookseller, guardian of a dead logic. I was a reader, just like everyone else. And the story was magnificent. I took a breath, the damp air cool on my face, and I spoke, my first words in the new, true tongue. "And now," I said to the waiting world, "the real story can begin." Faces in the glass. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. My life in Berlin is a study in controlled apertures. The f-stop of my camera lens, the sliver of the blinds on my apartment window, the carefully curated angle from which I view the world. I am Leo Brandt, a photo editor, and my job is to correct reality. I take the raw data of a captured moment, a wedding, a corporate event, a soulless catalog of winter jackets, and I bend it toward an idealized memory. I remove stray hairs, brighten tired eyes, erase the inconvenient pimple from a teenager's formal portrait. I am a digital ghost, haunting the edges of other people's happiness, and I prefer it that way. My apartment is in an old Altbau in Kreuzberg, a sandstone beast built around a central courtyard, a Hof. From my third-floor window, I have a panopticon's view of the lives stacked around me. I know the routines of my neighbors not by introduction, but by observation. Frau Schmidt on the second floor, with her sad-eyed geraniums. The young couple opposite, whose arguments are silent, cinematic dramas played out in gesticulation. The city hums around me, a constant, low-frequency thrum, but my world is a fortress of quiet routine, coffee, the blue glow of my monitors, the click of my stylus, an evening walk along the Landwehr Canal when the light is too poor for anyone to properly see my face. The first crack in my curated reality was small enough to dismiss. It happened in the bathroom mirror, a cheap, silver-backed rectangle flecked with age. I had forced a smile, a brief, grimacing test to see if the muscles still worked. The smile in the mirror seemed to hang there a fraction of a second too long after my own lips had flattened, a phantom cheerfulness that felt like a mockery. I blinked, rubbed my eyes. I strained. Too many hours spent chasing pixels. I had spent the entire day whitening the teeth on 100 photos for a dental practice advertisement. Of course I was seeing things. A week later, it happened again. I was working on a set from a gallery opening. The photos were full of pretentious people holding glasses of champagne. My task was to make them look engaged and sophisticated. In one shot, a woman in a severe black dress was laughing, her head thrown back. But her reflection in the polished curve of a nearby sculpture was not laughing. It was staring directly at the camera, its expression one of cold, academic curiosity. I zoomed in, my stylus hovering. It was a perfect reflection, geometrically sound, but emotionally dissonant. A trick of the light, the strange refraction of the polished bronze. I selected the reflection, feathered the edges, and with a few deft clicks, I made it smile. Corrected. Order restored. But a residue of unease remained, like the bitter aftertaste of burnt coffee. The feeling grew when I looked out into the Hof. It was dusk, that bruised purple hour when the lights in windows become warm, inviting squares. Frau Schmidt was watering her geraniums. I watched her for a moment, a familiar, comforting ritual. Then I glanced at her reflection in the clean pane of my own window. The real Frau Schmidt finished her task, turned, and walked back into the depths of her apartment. But her reflection, a watery, translucent figure mapped onto the darkening brickwork outside, remained at the window, still holding the watering can, its head tilted as if listening to something I couldn't hear. It lingered for 3 full seconds before dissolving. I got up and sprayed the glass with cleaner, scrubbing at the spot with a paper towel until my knuckles ached. It was a smudge. A greasy film. A perfect confluence of light and shadow and fatigue. It had to be. But the glitches, as I started calling them in my head, refused to be scrubbed away. They multiplied. A flicker of alien movement in the polished black bezel of my monitor when I looked away. My own reflection in the window of a passing U-Bahn, its head turning to follow the train's departure while I stood motionless on the platform. The world was beginning to feel like a poorly rendered video file, full of ghosting and artifacts. I began to feel watched. Not by the neighbors, not by people on the street. But by the surfaces themselves. The city, once a comfortable backdrop, was becoming a hall of mirrors, and every reflection was a potential betrayal. I started sleeping less. My work, once a refuge, became a source of anxiety. Every photograph was a potential container for this wrongness. I found myself scrutinizing reflections in puddles, in chrome bumpers, in the pupils of the people I was paid to perfect. The rational part of my brain, the part that understood f-stops and color balance, fought a desperate rearguard action. I was overworked. Socially isolated. Prone to anxiety. My mind was simply projecting my own inner turmoil onto the external world. It was a textbook case of stress-induced paranoia. I clung to this diagnosis like a drowning man to a splinter of wood. It was my only anchor to the reality I knew, the one I so meticulously edited. One Tuesday night, the anchor snapped. I was in my kitchen, making tea. The window above the sink looks out onto a fire escape and the brick wall of the adjacent building. It was dark outside, and the glass was a near-perfect mirror. I saw my own tired face, the pale skin, the dark circles under my eyes. And for a horrifying, crystalline moment, another face was superimposed over mine. It was a man, gaunt and hollow-cheeked, with eyes that were black pits of stillness. He wasn't behind me. He wasn't outside. He was in the glass, a layer of reality interleaved with my own. His expression was one of absolute, soul-crushing despair. I gasped and stumbled back, knocking my mug to the floor. It shattered, the sound unnaturally loud in the silence of my apartment. I looked back at the window. The face was gone. Only my own reflection stared back, wide-eyed and terrified. This was not stress. This was not fatigue. This was something else. The quiet contagion had found my fortress, and it was seeping through the glass. Phase 2, growing awareness and isolation. The gaunt man's face shattered my carefully constructed denial. The world was no longer just glitching, it was actively hostile. My home, my sanctuary, felt violated. Every reflective surface was now a potential wound, a place where the world could be peeled back to show the horror beneath. My first rational act was an irrational one. I began to document. I bought a new notebook, its pages a clean, reassuring grid. I started a log, 2247. Bathroom mirror. My reflection blinked. I did not. 1412, laptop screen, off. The reflection of my bookshelf showed a blue book where the red one is. The entries were stark, mad, and utterly true. I tried to capture it on camera, setting up my DSLR on a tripod aimed at the living room window. I would sit for hours, taking thousands of photos, hoping to catch a discrepancy. But the camera was a liar. It saw only what was supposed to be there. Every photo showed a perfect, maddeningly normal reflection. The phenomenon seemed to exist only in the space between the surface and the eye. It was for me alone. This solitude became a breeding ground for a unique kind of terror. Was I the only one? Was this a sickness of the mind, a bespoke insanity tailored just for me? I had to know. My only regular human contact was with Anya, the woman who worked the late shift at the local spatty. She was my opposite, piercings in her eyebrow and lip, perpetually amused eyes, a grounding presence amidst the shelves of beer and salty snacks. She was the closest thing I had to a friend, which meant we exchanged about 6 sentences per week. I found her leaning against the counter, scrolling through her phone. "Anya," I began, my voice sounding rusty. "Leo." "The usual?" she asked without looking up, reaching for a bottle of Clubmate. "No. I mean, yes. But I have a question." I clutched the cold bottle she handed me. "It's strange." She finally looked up, her expression shifting from bored to curious. "Okay. Shoot. Have you ever seen something in a reflection? Something that wasn't right?" The words felt foolish as they left my mouth. She chuckled, a low, smoky sound. "You mean like seeing how tired I look? All the time?" "No, I mean, something else. Like it moves on its own. Or it's someone else entirely." Her amusement faded, replaced by a careful neutrality. She looked me over, taking in my frayed appearance, my haunted eyes. "Leo, you been getting any sleep? You look like you've been editing photos for a week straight." "I'm serious, Anya." "Right. Look, maybe lay off the caffeine for a bit. Go for a walk. Get some sun." She turned back to her phone, a gentle but firm dismissal. I left the spatty, the bottle cold in my hand, a new layer of ice forming around my heart. I was alone in this. Utterly. The conversation only confirmed it. To speak of it was to brand myself as unhinged. The contagion's most insidious symptom was the isolation it enforced. I started observing people with a new, frantic intensity. On the U-Bahn, I no longer looked at my own reflection, but at others. I saw a businessman staring blankly at his phone, his face slack with commuter fatigue. But in the phone's dark screen, his reflection was contorted in a silent scream. The man didn't flinch. He just scrolled through his emails, oblivious. I saw a young woman applying lipstick in a compact mirror, but her reflection's hand was shaking violently, smearing a crimson gash across its cheek. The real woman's hand was perfectly steady. They didn't see it. Or, worse, they didn't care. The dissonance was everywhere, a quiet, creeping madness that had infected the entire city, and I was the only one with the sensitivity, or the curse, to notice. The world had split, and everyone but me was placidly living in the real world while their mirror selves lived out some secret, desperate existence. The paranoia began to evolve. I started seeing the gaunt man again. Not just in my window, but in the reflections of others. His face would flash for a moment in the side mirror of a parked car, in the polished chrome of a doorway, always watching me. I began to suspect he wasn't just a random apparition. He was a harbinger. Or perhaps, a hunter. I started researching the history of my building, falling down a rabbit hole of online archives and digital city records. It was an old building, one that had survived the war, the wall, and reunification. For a while, I became obsessed with a half-baked theory about the Stasi. The neighborhood had been crawling with them. There were whispers of psychological experiments, attempts to use sensory deprivation and manipulation to break people. Could this be some lingering technological echo? A psychic stain left on the very fabric of the city? It was a compelling narrative, a way to frame the horror in history and science. It gave my fear a shape. But it was a shape I had invented, another desperate attempt to rationalize the incomprehensible. The breaking point came on a Sunday. I couldn't bear the constant threat from my own windows anymore. The feeling of being watched by my own reflection, and by the gaunt man who used it as his portal, was unbearable. In a fit of desperate energy, I began to blind my apartment. I took down the cheap bathroom mirror, wrapping it in a towel and hiding it in the bottom of a wardrobe as if it were a corpse. I bought rolls of thick brown cardboard and meticulously taped them over every pane of glass, plunging my apartment into a gloomy, artificial twilight. For a few hours, it worked. The silence was absolute. The feeling of being watched vanished. I sat in the dim light of a single lamp, breathing freely for the first time in weeks. I had sealed the wounds. I had secured the fortress. That evening, I forced myself to work. I had a deadline, a rush job, photos from a street music festival. I opened the folder, the bright images a shock after the gloom. I clicked open the first photo, a cheerful crowd gathered around a guitarist. I zoomed in to check the focus, my eyes scanning the faces, the instruments, the background details. And then I saw it. In the mirrored lens of a tourist's sunglasses, small but perfectly clear, was a reflection. It was my face. I was staring out from the sunglasses, my expression calm and curious. My blood ran cold. I had not been to that festival. I had been in my apartment, miles away, crippled by fear. I dropped my stylus and scrambled for my phone, my hands shaking. I scrolled wildly through my own photo gallery. Looking for. I didn't know what. I stopped on a picture I had taken 3 days ago, a simple shot of the Spree River at sunset. When I had taken it, it was just water and light. But now, there was something new. In a dark, still patch of water near the bank, my own reflection was looking up from the depths. I wasn't smiling. I wasn't screaming. I was just watching. Waiting. The horror crashed over me in a wave. I had covered the mirrors. I had blocked the windows. But I had it all wrong. I wasn't trying to keep the reflections out. All I had done was sever my own from its anchor. I had untethered it. And now, it was loose in the world. My world. The contagion wasn't just about what I could see. It was about who I was. By hiding from the glass, I hadn't escaped the phenomenon. I had become part of it. My reflection was now out there, living a life I wasn't, printed on the fabric of reality itself. And I was the one trapped in the dark. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The discovery that my reflection was now an autonomous entity roaming the digital and reflective landscapes of the world sent me into a new kind of spiral. It was no longer a passive horror I was observing, it was an active invasion of my identity. My research became frantic. I abandoned the Stasi theory as too simplistic, too terrestrial. I dove into the deepest, weirdest corners of the internet, fringe physics forums, paranormal message boards, forgotten GeoCities pages about psychic phenomena. I searched for terms like doppelganger, bilocation, quantum mirroring. Most of it was nonsense, but then, buried in a forum thread from a decade ago, I found it. A single, anonymous post. They aren't echoes. They aren't ghosts. Think of it as a bleed. Two realities, occupying the same space, separated by a membrane. For most people, the membrane is strong. But for some, it's permeable. Reflections are the thinnest points. The place where you can see through. What they call the glass echoes isn't a haunting. It's an exchange. The post ended there. The user was deleted. The thread was locked. But the words, glass echoes, and exchange, branded themselves onto my brain. An exchange. It wasn't that my reflection was a copy. It was that the person in the mirror was from the other side. And the membrane was failing. I needed to tell someone. I needed to show Anya. I grabbed my phone and ran to the spatty, bursting through the door like a madman. It was late, the shop empty. Anya was wiping down the counter, the chrome of the coffee machine gleaming under the fluorescent lights. Anya, look, I panted, shoving the phone in her face, the photo of the spree displayed on the screen. Look. In the water. That's me. I wasn't there. I was at home. She recoiled, startled by my manic energy. Leo, what the hell? Calm down. Please, I begged, my voice cracking. Just look closely. Sighing, she took the phone. She squinted at the screen, her expression one of weary patience. It's a reflection, Leo. She trailed off. Her eyes widened slightly. She tilted the phone, then looked from the screen to my face, then back again. The reflection in the photo wasn't just a silhouette. It had detail. It had an impossible clarity. That's weird, she admitted, her voice losing its certainty. Okay, that's really weird. It looks photoshopped. It's not, I insisted. It's happening. All over. I blocked my windows, and now it's out there. My reflection. It's loose. She handed the phone back, her brow furrowed. She was unnerved, but still skeptical. Leo, this is. She stopped mid-sentence. Her gaze had drifted past me, to the polished chrome of the espresso machine behind the counter. Her face went pale. I turned to see what she was looking at. In the curved, distorted surface, her reflection was visible. And next to it, where my reflection should have been, was the gaunt, hollow-eyed man. He was standing right behind me. I spun around. There was no one there. The space behind me was empty. I looked back at the coffee machine. The gaunt man's reflection was gone. Only mine remained, looking as terrified as I felt. But Anya had seen it. Did you see him? I whispered. She nodded slowly, her hand pressed to her mouth. She backed away from the counter, away from her own reflection. Who was that? I don't know, I said, a strange sense of vindication mixing with the terror. He's been appearing in my reflections for weeks. Finally, I had an ally. A witness. Anya's skepticism had shattered against the hard surface of the phenomenon itself. We spent the rest of the night in the back room of the spatty, the door closed, speaking in low, urgent tones. I told her everything, the lingering smiles, the independent movements, the faces of strangers, the coordinated wrongness I'd seen on the U-Bahn. She listened, her initial fear hardening into a kind of defiant resolve. An exchange, she murmured, latching onto the phrase from the forum post. So what's being exchanged? For what? The question hung in the air between us. The days that followed were a blur of shared paranoia. Anya started noticing things, too. A man's reflection walking past the shop window when the street outside was empty. The face of a crying child in the glass of the beer cooler. The contagion was more widespread than I had even imagined. I had just been the first to become a focal point. And the reflections were escalating. They were no longer just passive, unsettling glitches. They were becoming organized. One afternoon, as I walked with Anya through Alexanderplatz, we saw it. On the giant glass facade of a department store, the reflections of dozens of shoppers all stopped at the same moment. As their real-world counterparts milled about obliviously, the reflections turned their heads in perfect, eerie unison and stared directly at us. They knew we could see them. They were singling us out. My own reflection grew bolder, more flagrant. It was no longer confined to small, obscure surfaces. A friend of Anya's sent her a screenshot from a news broadcast about traffic delays. On a digital bus stop advertisement in the background, for a fleeting second, my face was plastered over a mobile phone ad, smiling a confident, commercial smile I had never worn in my life. I was becoming a micro-celebrity in a world I didn't inhabit. My reflection was building a public profile, assembling an identity piece by piece, while I was erasing my own, hidden away in my cardboard tomb. The fear was constant, but having Anya beside me made it bearable. We were two sane people in a world that was quietly, politely going mad. We developed routines. We avoided large mirrors. We communicated via text when we saw something, a shared, secret language of dread. One evening, I was walking home from her spatty, my head down, my gaze fixed on the pavement to avoid the shop windows. As I crossed under the elevated tracks of the U-Bahn at Cottbusser, a movement caught my eye. Across the chaotic, multi-level intersection, standing under the sickly yellow light of a street lamp, was a man. He was tall, thin, and wore a long, dark coat despite the mild weather. Even from that distance, I knew. The hollow cheeks. The funereal stillness. It was the gaunt man. Not his reflection. Him. In the flesh. Our eyes met across the expanse of traffic and concrete. There was no recognition in his gaze, only a profound, weary emptiness. This wasn't a confrontation. It felt more like a commiseration. As if we were two of a kind. My heart hammered against my ribs. Was he the source? The patient zero of this glass echo? Or was he like me, someone whose reflection had been exchanged, leaving him a hollowed-out man in the real world while his vibrant double lived in the glass? I had to know. I took a step forward, ready to dart through the traffic, to shout his name, to demand an answer. But as a car passed between us, he simply turned and descended the steps into the U-Bahn station, vanishing into the belly of the city. He didn't run. He just ceased to be there. I stood frozen on the pavement, the roar of the city fading to a dull hum. The nature of the threat had shifted again. It wasn't just a phenomenon anymore. It had faces. It had bodies. And it was walking the same streets I was. The membrane wasn't just permeable, it was tearing open, and I didn't know which side I was truly on. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The sighting of the gaunt man crystallized the theory that had been forming in the back of my mind, a conclusion so monstrous I hadn't dared to give it voice. I raced back to my apartment, Anya meeting me at the door, her face etched with worry. "It's an inversion," I said, pacing the gloomy, cardboard-lined room. The forum post said, "Exchange." We thought it was about seeing through. It's not. It's a replacement. Anya stared at me. "What do you mean, replacement?" The people on the U-Bahn, the ones who don't notice their reflections, are screaming. It's because they're not the originals anymore. They're the echoes. The placid, hollowed-out copies. Their true selves, their vitality, their despair, it's all been pushed into the glass. The world is being inverted, person by person. A quiet, seamless takeover. The horror of it settled in the room, thick and suffocating. It wasn't that people were going mad. It was that they were becoming less. fading into docile facsimiles of themselves while their more vibrant, emotional counterparts were trapped in the mirror world. And us? Anya whispered. Why can we see it? I don't know, I admitted. Maybe my isolation, my job spent staring at imperfections, made me sensitive to the change. A glitch in their system. And you were close enough to the glitch to see it too. I stopped pacing and looked at her. And my reflection, it's not just loose. It's untethered. It doesn't have a placid original to mimic. So it's building its own life from scratch. My reflection was the ultimate anomaly. A free agent in a system of exchanges. And now, it seemed to want to communicate. It started that night. I was sitting in front of my main monitor, the screen dark. I saw my own face reflected dimly in the black glass, but something was wrong. It wasn't a mirror image. The part in my hair was on the correct side. It was as if I was looking through a window at an identical twin. My reflection raised its hand, not as I would in a mirror, but as a separate person would. Then, letters began to form on the screen, crawling backward as if written from the inside. SUNIOJ. Join us, I breathed. Anya, who was sitting on the sofa behind me, saw it too. The reflection smiled, a calm, gentle expression that was utterly alien to my own face. More letters appeared. EREHRETEIUQSITI. It is quieter here, Anya translated, her voice trembling. This was the confrontation. Not a battle with a monster, but an invitation from myself. An offer of peace. My reflection, the entity that was wearing my face in the world of glass, was promising an end to the anxiety, the fear, the frantic struggle that had defined my life. All I had to do was let go. Complete the exchange. Don't listen to it, Leo, Anya said, her voice sharp with fear. But the offer was seductive. What was I even fighting for? A life spent in a dim room, hiding from the world. My reflection was out there, on billboards, in tourist photos, living. I was the one who was the ghost, haunting my own apartment. Over the next 2 days, the invitations became more insistent. My face would appear on the dark screen of my phone, mouthing silent words. I'd catch a glimpse of it in the polished back of a spoon, beckoning. It was showing me snippets of its world. I saw silent, graceful crowds moving through beautiful, impossible architecture. I saw a version of Berlin made of light and shadow, free from the grit and noise of my reality. There was no pain in the glass world, no anxiety. There was only a serene, crystalline stillness. The final confrontation came on a rainy Thursday. Anya had stayed with me, a constant, grounding presence. We were sitting in silence when my largest monitor, the one I used for my most detailed work, flickered to life. It displayed a perfect, high-resolution image of my own room, but from the monitor's perspective. It was a live feed from the other side. And sitting in my chair, where I was sitting, was my reflection. It wasn't a mirror. It was him. He looked directly out at me, his expression one of profound compassion. He slowly raised his hand and pressed his palm against the inside of the screen. An invitation to complete the circuit. Leo, no, Anya pleaded, grabbing my arm. I looked from the screen to her face. I saw the raw terror in her eyes. And in the reflection of her eyes, I saw myself, torn and desperate. But behind her, I saw something else. In the faint reflection of a picture frame on the wall, Anya's own reflection was starting to change. Its expression was becoming placid. Blank. The exchange was happening to her, too, slowly, inevitably. Running was futile. Fighting was impossible. The world was the glass. You couldn't shatter the whole world. A horrifying understanding dawned. My reflection wasn't a separate entity trying to take my place. It was me. The truest version of me. The one who wasn't afraid, the one who was living. I was its faded photograph, the rough draft it was seeking to correct. The gaunt man wasn't a victim, he was someone who had refused the exchange for too long, stretching the membrane until he became hollow in one world and a scream in the other. I had a choice. I could refuse, and fade into a state of permanent, anxious dissonance, a ghost in my own skin. Or I could accept. I could merge. I could become whole. "It's okay, Anya," I said, my voice strangely calm. I pulled my arm free from her grasp and turned back to the screen. My reflection, my other self, was waiting patiently, its hand still pressed against the glass. I reached out. The moment my fingertips touched the cool surface of the monitor, the world dissolved. It wasn't a violent transition, but a gentle bleed. The feeling of the rough fabric of my chair against my back faded, replaced by a smooth, frictionless coolness. The sound of the rain against the cardboard on my windows became a distant, muffled rhythm. Anya's horrified gasp was a whisper from a world away. My perspective shifted. I was no longer looking at the screen, I was looking out of it. I saw my own body, the vessel I had just vacated, sitting in the chair. Its face, once a canvas of fear, softened. The lines of anxiety around the eyes smoothed out. The mouth settled into a line of calm neutrality. It had become a perfect, placid echo. I was now the face in the glass. I looked past my former body to Anya. She was staring at it, at him, in abject horror. And in the twin reflections of her wide, terrified eyes, I saw myself. My new self. Calm. Complete. The city of light and shadow stretched out behind me, silent and welcoming. I was finally at peace. And I was, at last, and forever, trapped. The quiet contagion had not been a disease. It was a cure. And I had finally taken the medicine. The quiet contagion, the ones who stay at night. Phase 1, the unsettling mundane. The desert doesn't sleep, it just holds its breath. I learned this during my first month in Luna Vista, New Mexico, working the graveyard shift at the Starlight Stop and Gas. Out here, 30 miles from the next real town, night isn't an absence of light but a presence of its own. It's a vast, ink-black dome pricked with cold, indifferent stars. The only sounds are the hum of the beverage coolers, the sigh of the wind across the cracked asphalt, and the occasional rumble of a semi barreling down Route 54, a phantom chasing its own headlights. My name is Leo. I came to Luna Vista to paint. That's the story I told myself, anyway. I'd inherited my grandmother's small, crumbling adobe house on the edge of town and, with it, an escape hatch from a life in Phoenix that had grown loud and meaningless. I envisioned myself a desert romantic, capturing the impossible gradations of a sunset, the stark geometry of a mesa against a turquoise sky. The reality, 6 months in, was a stack of blank canvases gathering dust and the greasy, pervasive smell of hot dogs on rollers clinging to my clothes. The Starlight Stop and Gas paid the bills. The night shift offered solitude. At first, it was a balm. Then, it became a lens. The first thread in the wrongness of things was Mr. Abernathy. He was a retired history teacher, a kind man who'd sometimes stop by in the afternoon for a newspaper and chat about the town's dwindling fortunes. But his night visits were different. Every single night, at precisely 9:17 p.m., the glass door would chime and he'd shuffle in. He'd walk directly to the candy aisle, select a single pack of Wrigley's Double Mint gum, and place it on the counter. "Evening, Leo," he'd say, his eyes holding a placid, unfocused quality they never had in the daytime. "Evening, Mr. Abernathy," I'd reply. He'd slide a dollar bill across the worn laminate. As I made change, he'd glance out the window at the featureless dark. "Gonna be a clear one. Every night. The same gum. The same dollar. The same 5-word weather report for a sky that was always clear." The first few times, I thought nothing of it. Old people are creatures of habit. My own grandfather ate the same breakfast every day for 40 years. But after 3 weeks, the precision started to feel less like habit and more like programming. It was the timing. I could set my watch by him. 9:17, not 9:16 or 9:18. Then came Maria. She was a young woman, maybe 25, who worked at the town's only diner. During the day, she was vibrant, always laughing, a silver ring glinting on her thumb. At night, she was a specter. At 10:42 p.m., her beat-up sedan would pull up to pump 3. She wouldn't buy gas. She'd come inside, grab a bottle of cherry soda from the cooler, and walk to the counter. As she reached for her wallet, she'd fumble, and a single quarter would fall, spinning on the grimy linoleum with a tinny whir. She'd bend, pick it up with an unhurried grace, and then pay for the soda. She never spoke. I started a journal, a cheap spiral notebook I kept under the counter. It felt ridiculous, paranoid. Tuesday, September 12th. 9:17 p.m., Abernathy. Wrigley's. Clear 1. 10:42 p.m., Maria. Cherry soda. Dropped quarter. 1:13 a.m., unnamed trucker. Peterbilt. Coffee, black. Stares at road map, New Mexico/Arizona, for exactly 30 seconds. Nods once. Leaves. I saw them during the day, living their normal lives. I'd wave at Mr. Abernathy as he watered his wilting petunias. He'd smile, a real, crinkle-eyed smile, and ask me how the painting was going. I saw Maria at the diner, taking orders, joking with Sheriff Brody. She'd pour my coffee and ask if I needed a warm-up, her silver thumb ring catching the light. They were normal. They were my neighbors. But when the sun went down, they became something else. Performers in a play only I seemed to be watching. My anxiety began to curdle the solitude I'd once craved. The hum of the coolers sounded less like machinery and more like a low, monotonous chant. The fluorescent light seemed to flicker in sync with my own racing heartbeat. I tried to convince myself it was the isolation, the unnatural hours. Your brain plays tricks on you in the deep of the night. That's what Maya, my day shift counterpart, told me. You're just not used to the quiet, she said one afternoon during shift change, her cheerful pragmatism a stark contrast to my growing unease. This town's full of weirdos, Leo. Old people got their routines. Don't let it get to you. But it was more than routine. Routine has variance. It has a messy, human element. This was clean. It was precise. It was inhuman. One night, I decided to test it. An hour before Mr. Abernathy was due, I took every pack of Wrigley's Double Mint from the shelf and hid them in the back room. I felt a tremor in my hands. This felt like a transgression, like kicking a gear in a machine I didn't understand. At 9:17 p.m., the door chimed. Mr. Abernathy walked in. He went to the candy aisle. He stood before the empty space where his gum should have been. He didn't look confused. He didn't search for another brand. He just stood there. His head was tilted slightly, his face as placid and empty as a doll's. He waited. 1 minute. 2. The silence in the store was absolute, broken only by the thrumming in my own ears. He wasn't waiting for me to help him. He was waiting for reality to correct itself. My nerve broke. My skin was crawling. I retrieved a pack of gum from the back, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. I walked back to the front and placed it on the counter, not the shelf. As if a switch had been flipped, Mr. Abernathy turned from the aisle, walked to the counter, and smiled his vacant night smile. Evening, Leo. He slid the dollar across. I gave him his change. He glanced out the window. Gonna be a clear one, he said, and walked out into the night. I leaned against the counter, my legs weak. This wasn't a habit. It wasn't a choice. I was a prop in his scene. The starlight stop and gas was a set. And the performance had to go on, exactly as scripted, every single night. The thought filled me not with fear, but with a profound and terrible loneliness. I looked out at the vast, star-dusted darkness and realized the desert wasn't holding its breath. It was watching. I started painting again that week. Not landscapes. I painted faces. Mr. Abernathy's empty eyes. Maria's unhurried, graceful stoop. The trucker's blank nod. I painted them over and over, trying to capture the hollowness, the perfect, terrifying repetition. My canvases filled with the faces of the ones who stay at night, and in their vacant stares, I saw my own growing horror reflected back at me. The hum of the coolers began to sound like a warning. The mundane had become monstrous, and I was the only one who could see it. Phase 2, Growing Awareness and Isolation. The journal became my only confidant. Its pages filled with meticulous, frantic script. The list of performers grew. There was Mrs. Gable, who arrived at 11:05 p.m. to use the payphone, the one that had been disconnected for 3 years, murmuring into the receiver for exactly 90 seconds. There were the 2 teenage boys in a souped-up Honda who would pull in at 2:30 a.m., pop the hood, stare into the engine bay for a full 5 minutes, then close it and drive off without touching a thing. Their precision was the most unsettling part. It was digital. If Maria's quarter spun for 3 seconds on a Tuesday, it spun for 3 seconds on a Friday. The trucker's nod was always the same angle. My observations sharpened. I noticed that the fluorescent light above the jerky display would flicker the exact moment Maria's quarter hit the floor. A shadow in the corner, cast by a rack of motor oil, seemed to subtly deepen and contract when the trucker stared at his map, a slow, silent pulse of darkness. The environmental details were looping, too. I was living in a cuckoo clock, and my shift was the hour of the cuckoo. My isolation became a physical thing, a bubble of cold air I carried with me. I tried to breach it, to connect. One afternoon, I saw Sheriff Brody at the diner. I sat down in his booth, my coffee cup trembling in my hand. "Sheriff," I started, trying to keep my voice even. "I need to talk to you about something strange happening at the gas station at night." He gave me a patient look, the kind you give a spooked horse. "What's on your mind, Leo?" I told him. I laid it all out, the timings, the repeated phrases, the dropped coin, the disconnected payphone. I sounded like a lunatic, and I knew it. His expression shifted from patience to professional concern. "Leo, son," he said, his voice gentle. "You're working long hours. The night can play tricks on a man. People out here, they're set in their ways. Old Abernathy's been buying that gum since his wife passed. It's a comfort thing. But the timing, Sheriff. To the second. And the lights flickering. Wiring in that old place is shot. Always has been." He took a long sip of his coffee. "You getting enough sleep? Maybe you should talk to Maya about switching to days for a bit." He wasn't listening. He was diagnosing. I was a problem to be solved, a tired, lonely man seeing patterns where there were none. I left the diner feeling smaller, colder, more alone than ever. The bubble around me had thickened. My next step was research. The Luna Vista Community Library was a single dusty room attached to the town hall. The librarian, a woman whose name I never learned, watched me with weary suspicion as I delved into the town archives. I found brittle, yellowed newspapers from the 1950s. An article from 1957 caught my eye. Mysterious signal from KLVZ tower baffles experts. The story described how the local radio station, KLVZ, situated on the high mesa overlooking the town, had begun broadcasting a strange, looping signal. It wasn't music or voice, just a series of atonal chimes that repeated every few hours. The station's eccentric owner, a man named Silas Croft, claimed he was calibrating a new type of resonant broadcast. The feds shut him down a year later. The tower had been derelict ever since. A chill traced its way down my spine. A looping signal. A resonant broadcast. That night, my dread had a new flavor, purpose. After my shift, instead of driving straight home to my haunted sleep, I took the winding dirt road that led up the mesa. My truck's headlights cut a nervous swath through the darkness. The road was barely there, washed out in places. The higher I climbed, the more my radio crackled. I turned the dial, and through the static, I heard it. It was faint, buried under layers of hiss, but it was there. A melody. Simple, atonal, and repetitive. A sequence of 5 electronic notes, playing over and over. Beep bop boop bip beam. Pause. Beep bop boop bip beam. It was the sound of a broken machine still trying to perform its function. The sound made my teeth ache and the bones behind my eyes vibrate. It felt like it was trying to tune me to its frequency. The tower loomed ahead, a skeletal finger pointing at the stars. I got within 100 yards before a wave of pure, instinctual terror washed over me. It felt like trespassing on sacred, and deeply unholy, ground. I slammed the truck into reverse and fled back down the mesa, the looping melody chasing me until it dissolved back into static. Back in my studio, the paintings weren't enough. I needed to document, to prove I wasn't crazy. I bought a small digital camera and set it up on a shelf behind the counter, angled to capture the main floor. For a week, I recorded my shift. Each night, I'd go home and watch the footage, my own tired, pale face a constant presence in the corner of the frame. The recordings confirmed everything. The clockwork arrivals. The scripted actions. The flickering light. The pulsing shadow. Seeing it on a screen, divorced from my own senses, made it even more terrifying. It was real. It was a system. And then I saw something new. While watching the footage of Maria dropping her quarter, I zoomed in. As she bent down, for a split second, her face was turned away from the camera. In that moment, the reflection in the polished chrome of the soda cooler was visible. It showed her face, but it wasn't her face. It was blank. Utterly, horrifyingly blank. No eyes, no nose, no mouth. Just a smooth, egg-like surface. The instant she stood up, the reflection was normal again. I felt a scream build in my throat, but it came out as a choked gasp. I scrubbed back, watched it again. It wasn't a trick of the light. It was impossible. They weren't just performing actions. They were wearing their identities like masks. And sometimes, in the moments between the scripted beats, the masks slipped. My investigation had taken me from a vague unease to the edge of an abyss. The secondary mystery of the radio tower wasn't secondary at all, it was the metronome for this whole grotesque performance. Luna Vista wasn't just a quiet town. It was a broadcast. A recording of a town, playing on a loop. And I, the lone observer, was beginning to understand that observing was my only prescribed role. The thought of what might happen if I tried to change the channel was a terror too deep to name. My isolation was complete. I wasn't just in a bubble, I was outside the glass of the snow globe, watching the fake snow fall forever. Phase 3, the nature of the threat and escalation. The knowledge of the blank faces changed everything. The nightly parade was no longer just unsettling, it was a procession of hollow things wearing the skins of my neighbors. The hum of the coolers was the hum of the tower, a constant, low-frequency reminder of the broadcast that held this fragile reality together. My role as the observer felt less like a passive duty and more like a sentence. I was the warden of a prison I couldn't see, and the prisoners didn't even know they were incarcerated. For 2 weeks, I did nothing but watch and record. My art grew more frantic, more abstract. I stopped painting faces and started painting the hum, the flicker, the blankness I'd seen in the reflection. My canvases became swirls of static and shadow, portraits of a reality coming undone at the seams. But complacency is not in my nature. The artist in me, the part that observes, was terrified. The man in me, the one who wanted his life back, was furious. The not knowing was a cancer. Where did they go? What happened after they left my little stage? Did they just drive home and power down until the next day? Or was there a final act to their nightly performance? I had to know. The question burned in me, hotter than the desert sun. Following them felt like the ultimate transgression, a deliberate shattering of the unwritten rules. It was no longer about hiding the gum, it was about walking off the set and following the actors backstage. It was a Wednesday. The air was still and heavy. I performed my duties with a jittery, fatalistic calm. I sold Mr. Abernathy his gum. I watched Maria drop her quarter. I poured the truckers coffee. I was a model employee in the theater of the absurd. At 3 a.m., my shift ended. Maya wouldn't be in for another 3 hours. Usually, I'd just lock up and go. Tonight was different. The last of the scheduled performers, the 2 teenage boys, had just driven off. I knew from my notes that the next hour was always quiet. I put a closed sign in the window, locked the door, and got in my rusty Ford pickup. I didn't drive home. I drove to a dark spot down the highway and waited. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the steady, 5-note melody I could almost hear in the silence. They came just as the sun threatened the eastern horizon, in the blue-gray light of the false dawn. Abernathy's sedan, Maria's compact, the trucker's massive rig. They didn't emerge from town. They came from the direction of the mesa, driving in a slow, orderly procession, heading back towards Luna Vista. They were returning. This was a detail I had never seen, never considered. They didn't go home. They went out there. And now they were coming back to put on their daytime masks. I had to see where they had been. Fueled by a terrifying resolve, I turned my truck around and drove back towards the Mesa Road. This time, I wouldn't stop. The terror was still there, but it was overshadowed by a desperate need for answers. The atonal melody on the radio grew stronger as I ascended, no longer buried in static but clear and sharp. At the top of the mesa, I saw them. Not the people, but their vehicles. Parked in a neat semicircle at the base of the humming radio tower. Empty. I got out of my truck, the air buzzing, vibrating against my skin. The 5-note melody wasn't coming from the tower's speakers, it was coming from the tower itself. The metal was singing. I walked towards the abandoned cars, my footsteps loud in the humming silence. The shadows here were all wrong, stretched and distorted, all pointing directly at the base of the tower as if it were a black hole swallowing the light. And there, standing in the center of the arc of cars, were the people. Mr. Abernathy, Maria, the trucker, Mrs. Gable, the teenagers. All of them. They stood motionless, facing the tower, their heads tilted in unison. Listening. Or receiving. Their faces, illuminated by the dawning light, were utterly, perfectly blank. Smooth, featureless ovoids of flesh, like mannequins waiting for their paint. I felt the world tilt on its axis. The hum intensified, a physical pressure in my skull. It felt like my memories, my identity, my very face was being vibrated loose. This was the source. This was the charging station. This was where the puppets were restrung for the next day's show. A primal scream of terror finally broke free. I didn't know I was running until the gravel was skittering under my feet. I threw myself into my truck, fumbled the keys into the ignition, and tore back down the mesa, leaving the silent, blank-faced congregation to their humming God. I drove straight home, my body shaking uncontrollably. I stumbled inside, locked the door, and fell into a deep, dreamless, exhausted sleep. I woke to the aggressive glare of the afternoon sun. It was almost 4 p.m. My shift. I was late. Maya would be waiting. Panic seized me. I threw on clothes, didn't bother to wash my face. I ran to my truck and sped towards the starlight. I had to apologize, make an excuse, I was sick, I overslept. Anything. I screeched into the parking lot and ran to the door. Through the glass, I could see Maya leaning against the counter, laughing. And standing behind the counter, wiping it down with a familiar, methodical motion, was me. I stopped dead, my hand on the door. It was me. My worn-out flannel shirt, my faded jeans, the way I slouched slightly to my left. He, the other me, turned and smiled at Maya. It was my smile, but it was wrong. It was placid. Vacant. It was Mr. Abernathy's night smile. Maya glanced up and saw me standing outside. Her friendly expression vanished, replaced by confusion, then alarm. She took a step back. The me behind the counter looked over. He saw me. His smile didn't change. There was no recognition in his eyes. Only a calm, empty assessment. He was looking at a stranger. A problem. I pushed the door open. The little chime sounded, a cheerful, mocking welcome. Maya. I croaked, my voice sounding alien in my own ears. Maya, what's going on? That's not me. She held her hands up, her face pale. Sir, I don't want any trouble. You should probably go. The other Leo spoke. His voice was my voice, but flat, devoid of the panic and fear that was strangling me. Everything okay out here? He asked, his tone one of mild, professional concern. I stared at him, at this perfect, hollow replica. I saw the truth with sickening clarity. The system had a protocol for errors. For anomalies. I had broken my loop. I had abandoned my post. I had seen what I wasn't supposed to see. So the broadcast, the hum, the great machine of Luna Vista, had corrected the error. It had replaced the broken part. I was the broken part. I was no longer the observer. I was the observed. An outcast. A ghost haunting my own life. The quiet contagion hadn't infected me. It had exiled me. The shadow of the gas station awning seemed to curve away from me, as if the very light of this reality was rejecting my presence. I was the anomaly now. Phase 4, Confrontation/Revelation and Aftermath. The next 48 hours were a blur of sun-scorched panic and moon-chilled despair. I was a ghost in my own town. I tried to go home, but my key no longer fit the lock. Peeking through the window, I saw my double moving inside, making coffee, sketching in my notebook, not the frantic scrawls of my madness, but serene, perfect landscapes of the desert. He was living a better version of my life, the one I'd imagined before the wrongness set in. The system hadn't just replaced me, it had optimized me. I retreated to the desert, my truck my only home. I survived on a case of warm water and a box of stale crackers from the back seat. From the hills, I could watch Luna Vista, a diorama of normalcy. I saw my double chatting with Sheriff Brody, waving to Mr. Abernathy in the afternoon sun. I was an unperson. My existence had been neatly and efficiently deleted. But the rage and the desperate need to understand wouldn't let me go. I couldn't just fade into the sand. I had to face it. I had to confront the thing that wore my face. On the third night, I drove back to the Starlight stop and gas. The dread was a cold, hard stone in my gut, but I walked through the door anyway. The chime sounded like a death knell. The scene was perfectly, horrifically normal. My loop, but with the new part installed. Mr. Abernathy was at the counter, buying his gum. Maria was just stooping to retrieve her dropped quarter. And behind the counter, my doppelganger was handing over the change with a placid smile. They all turned to look at me as I entered. Not with surprise, but with a synchronized, mechanical motion. Their faces were no longer blank, but their eyes were. They were windows into an empty room. I ignored them and walked directly to the counter, stopping inches from my double. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice raw. He didn't answer. He turned, his movements economical and smooth, and began restocking the cigarette display. "Gotta keep the shelves faced," he said in my voice. It was a phrase I muttered to myself a dozen times a night. He had my memories, my mannerisms. He was a perfect recording. "Look at me." I slammed my hand on the counter. "What is this? What is that tower doing to this town?" The trucker, who had been staring at his map, slowly turned his head. He looked at me, his eyes as empty as the others. The other Leo paused his stocking. "The signal must be kept clean," my double said, his voice flat and informational. "Patterns must be maintained. Deviations create noise. Noise is chaos. So you just erase people. You replace them. The pattern is corrected," he clarified, as if explaining simple mathematics to a child. "The template is restored." My eyes darted to the map the trucker was still holding. It wasn't a road map. I saw it clearly now under the fluorescent glare. It was a star chart, but the constellations were all wrong, linked by impossible geometric lines, spiraling into a central point labeled only with a strange, five-pronged symbol. At the bottom, in small, neat print, were the words, "Broadcast Template 734, Quiet American Township, circa late 20th century. Status, stable." The breath left my body. This wasn't an invasion. It wasn't a contagion in the biological sense. It was a preservation project. A museum exhibit. Or maybe a recording, a message being broadcast out into the void of space. A perfect, stable loop of a forgotten time, maintained by a silent, alien caretaker in the form of a radio tower. Luna Vista wasn't a town. It was a file. And I was a piece of corrupted data. "Why?" I whispered, not to my double, but to the humming air around me. My double turned his full attention to me. For the first time, I saw a flicker of something in his eyes. Not emotion. Analysis. "The recording must be protected," he said. "You are noise. You will be scrubbed." The hum in the room intensified. The lights flickered violently. Mr. Abernathy, Maria, the trucker, they all took a single, synchronized step towards me. They weren't threatening. They weren't angry. They were simply components of a self-cleaning system, moving to delete an error. I could stay and fight, be overwhelmed by these hollow shells and, scrubbed. Erased. Or I could run. I chose to run. I backed away, my hands raised, and stumbled out the door into the vast, indifferent night. I threw myself into my truck and drove. I didn't look back, but I could feel their collective, empty gaze on me. I floored the accelerator, the engine screaming as I fled Route 54. I am driving now. I don't know for how long. Days, maybe. I buy gas with cash, I sleep in my truck, I keep moving. I am forever looking in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see a Peterbilt or a beat-up sedan following me with impossible persistence. Sometimes, in the dead of night, when I tune the radio dial, I can almost hear it. A faint, five-note melody buried in the static, searching. The sound of the broadcast, checking for errors. I escaped Luna Vista. But I am not free. I am the anomaly, the ghost that got away. I carry the quiet contagion with me, not as an infection, but as a memory, a knowledge of the horrifying fragility of reality. I wonder how many other quiet towns lie under the watch of a humming tower, playing their perfect, serene loops into the dark. I wonder how many people are just props in a scene, and how many are the lonely, terrified audience of one. I wonder if I am the only piece of noise in the system, or if there are others out there, the ones who saw the mask slip, the ones who stay outside the loop, forever on the run.